They survived winters that killed entire bloodlines, and you were never meant to know how close humanity came to disappearing in the snow. Their struggles were buried under time, their endurance hidden behind the warmth we take for granted. Every breath they drew was a quiet defiance against a world built to erase them. Tonight you will step into the cold they once faced, and feel how survival truly began. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to stand at the entrance of a prehistoric valley, as winter settled in, the cold would arrive not as a gust of wind, but as a slow tightening around the world. A quiet pressure that erased color, sound, and warmth alike. The air did not simply feel cold. It felt purposeful, as if the season itself intended to test the limits of every living thing. Long before humans understood the patterns of climate or the science of survival, they already knew one truth. With painful clarity, winter did not forgive hesitation. The snow deepened early, the frost spread across stone and bone, and the nights grew so long that even the stars seemed reluctant to keep watch. The cold of prehistory was not the cold we imagine today. It stretched across months, with no promise of relief, burying landscapes in silence. Modern people think of winter as a season of fireplaces and insulated walls, but these early humans had none of that. Their shelters were shallow impressions in the earth, caves borrowed from animals or crude arrangements of branches patched together with hides. The cold slipped through every gap. It crept beneath furs. It gnawed at fingers and toes until sensation disappeared entirely. It is almost comical to imagine that simply wrapping oneself in a thick coat could solve what was for them a daily negotiation with death. Predators were no safer than their prey during these months, and hunger made them reckless. Wolves moved closer to human camps, eyes shining in the dark like small, cold moons. Large cats prowled the edges of firelight, desperate enough to challenge even organized groups. When the cold intensified, everything with a heartbeat became both hunter and hunted, equally fragile in the grip of the season. Humans were vulnerable not only to the creatures around them, but also to the silent violence within the cold itself. A body did not freeze all at once. It began with shivers, then numbness, then the slow unraveling of thought. Many did not notice the moment when sleep began to feel warmer than waking. Families huddled together in the faint protection of shared breath, but even that offered little comfort. The cold could pass through bodies the way water passes through sand. A single, careless decision leaving the fire untended, staying too long away from shelter, misjudging a storm, could claim a life within hours. To stand outside during such moments was to feel the world narrowing, shrinking to a point where breathing itself became a negotiation. The wind scraped across exposed skin like a stone blade. The ground hardened into an unwelcoming surface that preserved footprints for days, as if marking the final path of those who failed to return. Food was scarce. Animals migrated or burrowed deep into shelter. Plants offered nothing. Without calories, the human body loses its ability to generate heat. Fat reserves dwindled, limbs stiffened. The cold punished the weak first, the elderly, the sick, the very young. Infants rarely survived their first winter, unless the group was unusually well prepared. If it happened today, people might describe it as living through a season designed to extinguish hope rather than preserve life. Children, unaware of the danger, often wandered too far from the camp. Their footprints trailed off into the whiteness, and sometimes they did not return. Adults would search until the light failed, but the land swallowed sound and direction. Snow could cover a small body in minutes. For many families, winter meant loss before it meant survival. There was no concept of warmth as modern people know it. Warmth was not comfort. Warmth was a brief interruption of suffering. A fire once built became the fragile center of existence. Every spark mattered. Every ember was guarded. A single gust of wind or lapse in attention could extinguish the only barrier between life and death. I often think that no modern warning label or safety manual could convey the raw truth of how a single mistake could erase an entire lineage. Hunting during winter was an act of desperation. Men and women followed faint tracks through deep drifts, breath crystallizing around their lips. A successful hunt meant a few more days of life. A failed one meant watching a loved one weaken slowly, slipping away while the cold pressed closer. The meat froze almost instantly after the kill, and even chewing it became difficult. Some groups softened frozen flesh with stones heated in fire, pressing the meat against them to thaw it just enough to swallow. The scene must have been both harsh and strangely intimate. Hands trembling, steam rising breath, mingling with smoke. The cold made even simple injuries catastrophic. A cut that might heal easily in summer, festered in winter. Frostbite, blackened fingers and toes. Infection set in quickly. Without warmth, the body struggled to fight back. People learned to move carefully to avoid unnecessary risks, to read the sky for signs of storms. They became experts in the language of survival long before language itself had fully formed. To witness such a winter, even from the detached perspective of history, is to understand how fragile human life once was. These early humans lived in a world where death was never an abstraction. It was a constant presence, quiet but alert, always waiting near the threshold. And yet, despite everything they endured, they adapted. They persisted through the long dark in ways that remain both humbling and unsettling to imagine. Shared suffering created bonds stronger than blood. When someone shivered, others moved closer. When a fire dimmed, multiple hands reached forward at once. Survival was not an individual act. It was collective endurance. The cold may have been merciless, but humans learned to be stubborn in return. Some nights, when the wind howled down from the mountains like a living creature, they must have wondered whether the world itself wanted them gone. And yet they stayed, holding their small circles of light against an ocean of darkness. The cold they faced was not simply a season. It was a reminder that existence itself was borrowed, never guaranteed. They had only just begun to understand the depth of the winter that surrounded them. Another truth waited in the silence, one that pressed closer than the wind itself. And somewhere beyond the glow of their fragile fire, something else was already testing their resolve. The land did more than hold the cold. It amplified it, twisted it, and turned it into something sharper than wind alone could ever manage. In prehistoric winters, geography was not simply the setting of life. It was the judge, the threat, and the silent architect of every fate that unfolded across the frozen earth. Some regions surrendered easily to winter, while others fought it with jagged cliffs and deep forests. Yet all of them demanded a price from the humans who attempted to survive there. The northernmost territories were the harshest, the kind of places where even sound seemed to freeze in the air. Darkness smothered the land for most of the day, and when the sun did appear, it offered more light than warmth. Snow covered the earth so deeply that walking became an exhausting test of endurance. The wind gathered speed as it swept across open plains, cutting through layers of fur as though peeling back the body itself. It is almost amusing how modern travelers romanticize the Arctic, imagining it as a place for adventure rather than a place where breath itself becomes a burden. People who lived in such extreme latitudes faced a winter that consumed the world around them. Rivers hardened into solid, shimmering pathways that concealed lethal fractures beneath the surface. Hillsides lost their definition beneath layers of snow. Even the trees seemed to fold into themselves, branches stiff and silent, as if trying to avoid the winter's attention. The cold here was not simply a season. It was an entity that imposed order on every living thing. In more temperate regions, the danger was different, but no less real. These lands experienced a winter that shifted constantly, as if undecided about its own severity. Wet cold seeped into clothing, soaking furs until they clung heavily to the skin. Temperatures rose and fell, unpredictably, freezing water one day and releasing it the next, creating treacherous ground where a single misstep could mean injury or death. Humans had to adapt to both extremes, the biting cold of the night and the deceptive thaw of midday. Migration might seem like the obvious solution, but it was often a fantasy more than a plan. Groups could not simply walk away from a landscape that no longer supported them. Moving meant exposing themselves to predators, starvation, and unfamiliar terrain. It meant risking children, elders, and anyone too weak to endure long distances. Entire families could vanish during migration, their trails disappearing beneath fresh snowfall. If someone today had to cross hundreds of miles on foot through unstable weather, they would likely realize how survival is less about strength and more about surrendering illusions. Those who stayed in their ancestral lands faced a constant negotiation with the environment. They learned to memorize every contour of the terrain, where the wind hit hardest, where the ice cracked first, where the snow drifted deepest. They understood which caves trapped warmth and which ones funneled cold air like a deadly breath. Knowledge was not optional. It was inherited, guarded, and proven through survival. Losing someone who understood the land meant losing a map that could not be redrawn. The northern regions punished miscalculations instantly. Groups had to anticipate storms by reading the sky, noticing faint halos around the moon, or feeling subtle changes in the air. A false prediction could trap them far from shelter. Storms did not arrive gently. They struck with sudden force, burying tracks, hiding landmarks, and disorienting even the most experienced hunters. Those caught outside often froze before they were even missed. In areas further south, the danger unfolded more slowly but just as decisively. Moisture crept into shelters, turning floors into cold, muddy traps. Fires struggled to stay lit in damp conditions. Wood cracked unpredictably. Food supplies spoiled. Illness spread quickly in enclosed spaces where the cold mingled with stagnant air. People spent nights listening to the wind slip through every gap in their shelters, as if the winter were searching for a way inside. Geography also shaped the behavior of animals. Predators followed the paths of migrating herds, and humans, who depended on the same animals for food, found themselves chased, cornered, or forced into competition. In areas where prey diminished, predators grew desperate. They ventured into human camps, drawn by the scent of stored meat or the weakness in a group. A single wolf pack could alter the fate of an entire winter. Terrain determined everything, from where people slept to how they hunted. Deep valleys offered shelter from the winds, but trapped cold air like a bowl. Flat plains provided visibility but no protection. Forests hid both prey and danger. Mountains presented escape routes that could turn deadly in a single misstep. Every choice was a gamble, and every gamble required a deep understanding of the land. Nightfall magnified these challenges. The cold intensified. The world narrowed to the radius of a fire's glow. Shadows stretched into unsettling shapes. Travelers could not rely on the moon, which often hid behind clouds or snowstorms. Without clear landmarks, groups risked becoming lost within their own territories. The land which looked familiar during summer transformed into an unforgiving maze. Geography also shaped emotional survival. People who lived in exposed tundras endured a kind of loneliness that pressed in from every direction. Those in dense forests felt the claustrophobia of darkness enclosing them. Mountain dwellers learned to expect the unexpected: falling rocks, sudden winds, unstable paths. These emotional landscapes were as real as the physical ones, and they shaped the rhythms of daily life. Each group developed its own strategies. Some built shelters partially underground to trap heat. Others relied on natural rock formations to block the wind. Many lived in constant readiness, knowing that the land could betray them at any moment. Their understanding of geography was not scientific but instinctual, an accumulation of small observations gathered through generations. I often find myself imagining how many lives were decided not by violence or illness, but simply by the tilt of a hill or the sudden collapse of a frozen stream. Through all of this, prehistoric humans persisted. They carved out routines, forged paths, and learned the boundaries of their environments. They survived because they could not afford to do otherwise. In a world where the land itself held power over life and death, adaptation was the only form of resistance available to them. Their struggle with the land revealed only a fraction of what winter demanded. Another force waited, one that burned and disappeared with equal cruelty, and in the dim light of their earliest shelters, they began to understand what it meant to keep hope alive. Fire did not simply warm prehistoric humans. It defined the line between those who endured winter and those who disappeared into it. Without fire, the cold stole breath, stiffened limbs, and slowed thought until even the simplest task became impossible. With fire, life regained a narrow but vital margin. It offered heat protection, and the illusion, however fragile, that survival was still within reach. In the earliest winters, when storms erased paths and darkness swallowed entire valleys, the presence or absence of a single flame could determine the fate of a family, a group, or an entire lineage. The ability to create fire did not come easily. Early humans first encountered it in its wildest forms: lightning striking, dry brush, molten earth, spilling from volcanic cracks, and spontaneous blazes that devoured forests. These fires were unpredictable, dangerous, and impossible to replicate, yet they became the first teachers. Humans learned to steal burning branches, to cradle glowing embers, to carry them from place to place with trembling hope. It was not mastery. It was borrowing, preserving what the world had accidentally given. Those who managed to keep fire alive traveled farther, hunted longer, and resisted the cold that claimed so many others. Keeping fire alive mattered more than creating it. Flames needed constant attention. A moment of carelessness, a sudden gust, a forgotten ember, a night of heavy snow could erase hours of effort. Families placed fire at the center of their camps, surrounding it as if it were a living member of the group. Children slept closest to the warmth. Hunters returned to it as if returning to a heartbeat. Fire consumed woodbone and dried grasses with equal hunger, and humans fed it tirelessly, knowing that its glow represented the last barrier between themselves and the dark. To make fire intentionally required knowledge painfully gained through observation. Stones that sparked when struck together, bark that caught flame more willingly than others, grasses that smouldered slowly enough to transport heat. The earliest attempts must have been met with disbelief, then relief, then fierce attachment. Fire, once understood, became something to protect with devotion. It is almost humorous to think about how effortlessly people today light stoves or candles, unaware that their ancestors once guarded a single ember as though it were a newborn child. The cold made every part of fire-keeping harder. Damp wood resisted burning. Frozen hands struggled to strike stones together. Snow buried tinder. Smoke thickened in low shelters, stinging the eyes and filling lungs with heaviness. Yet even painful smoke was better than the sharp emptiness of cold air. Fire allowed meat to be cooked, bones to be cracked, for marrow wounds to be cauterized and water to be made safe. Without it, winter became an executioner that required no weapon. Accidents were common. A fire might die during the night when someone fails to feed it. A storm might scatter embers into the snow. A careless movement could smother the last spark. In such moments, panic set in quickly. Groups sent out runners to find fire elsewhere, another camp, a distant shelter, a surviving ember, hidden beneath a layer of ash. The journey itself was dangerous. Wolves followed the scent of smoke. Frozen ground made every step a hazard. But the alternative, returning empty-handed, meant facing the cold without protection. Certain individuals became guardians of the flame. Their hands were steady, their instincts sharp. They knew how to arrange wood, how to predict storms, how to revive a dying ember with patience. These people were not leaders by strength or dominance. They were leaders because they held the knowledge that sustained life. Losing such a person to illness or accident left groups shaken, suddenly aware of how fragile their hold on warmth truly was. If the same responsibility existed today, many would discover how terrifying it feels to know that one mistake could plunge an entire community into darkness. The fire's glow also reshaped the emotional landscape of winter. People gathered around it to work, eat, rest, and repair tools. Shadows flickered across the walls of caves. Stories were murmured not for entertainment, but to keep wakefulness alive during the longest nights. Fire turned harsh silence into something bearable. Without it, winter felt endless. With it, winter remained brutal, but at least it was survivable. Danger, however, lurked with independence. Fire made people stationary. Camps became predictable. Predators learned to associate firelight with human prey or scavenged remains. Smoke revealed the location to rival groups. Even so, no one could abandon fire, not when its absence invited death faster than any enemy. Generations passed, and fire became more than a tool. It became memory, ritual, and symbol. People learned to store dried wood ahead of winter, to select shelters that protected flames from the wind, and to carry embers wrapped in moss or bark during travel. Fire was no longer borrowed from the world. It was preserved, nurtured, and guarded with devotion. I often think that fire was the first thing humans trusted more than the land around them, because it offered warmth without asking for anything but vigilance in return. In this way, fire shaped not only survival but identity. It separated those who endured from those who vanished. It bound families together. It illuminated the first expressions of fear, hope, and determination. Fire was the promise that winter could be endured, even if victory was never certain. Holding fire gave them strength, but the cold still pressed at every boundary of their lives. Another truth waited in the spaces where warmth faded and shadows gathered. In that uneasy darkness, something else began to test their will to survive. Before humans understood the movement of seasons or the patterns of storms, they learned a simpler truth: the bodies of animals held the warmth their own bodies could not keep. Fur was more than a covering. It was a barrier between life and the cold that reached for them every winter. In the prehistoric world, where temperatures could fall far faster than a fire could be built, animal hides became the first shield humans ever crafted for themselves. Without them, winter was not merely difficult, it was impossible. The earliest attempts to use hides must have been clumsy. Raw skins froze into stiff, unwearable slabs. Moisture trapped inside them turned to ice. Improperly cleaned hides rotted or attracted predators with their lingering scent. Only through repeated failures did humans begin to understand how to transform a dead animal's warmth into their own survival. They learned to remove fat and sinew, to stretch the hide across stones or branches, to let it dry slowly, and to smoke it if possible. The process was long, tiring, and unforgiving. A single mistake could ruin days of work and leave a family exposed to the cold. As skills improved, hides changed from crude coverings into something deliberately crafted. Thicker furs were placed outward to catch snow. Softer inner hides were worn close to the skin. People learned to wrap themselves in layers, trapping warm air between them. Hides protected joints, faces, and hands, areas that the cold always sought first. With each improvement, humans extended their reach into colder lands. It is almost amusing that modern clothing brands boast about insulation, unaware that the first true winter coat was simply whatever an ancient hunter could carry home. But proficiency varied widely. Some groups lived among animals whose hides were naturally thick and easy to work with, while others relied on creatures with less protective fur. Certain regions forced people to use every scrap of material they could find, sewing together pieces from multiple animals just to cover a single body. Tools mattered as well. A dull stone blade made the work slow and painful. A sharper one transformed the task entirely. Techniques spread unevenly through ancient communities, creating stark differences in survival. One group might endure winter after winter, wrapped securely in well-prepared hides, while another perished in the same valley, lacking the knowledge to protect themselves. Drying and preserving hides demanded constant attention. Wet fur was dangerous. It absorbed cold, grew heavy, and could hasten hypothermia. People learned to hang hides near the fire, shifting them often to avoid burning the edges. Smoke toughened them. Cold air stiffened them. A well-prepared hide became a source of pride, a marker of a skilled hand. If someone today had to tan a hide with nothing but stones, fire, and patience, they would likely understand how survival was not only about strength, but about mastering the slow and tedious work that winter required. The coldest regions required even greater precision. Larger animals provided hides thick enough to resist fierce winds, but hunting such creatures demanded immense risk. A single kill could supply protective clothing for an entire family, but failure meant frostbite, starvation, or death. Some groups followed herds across frozen plains, hoping to strike before the animals migrated. Others waited near natural traps, narrow passes, icy riverbanks, steep ravines. Every piece of fur came with a cost, often paid in blood or exhaustion. Once prepared, hides transformed daily life. Sleeping on bare ground had once meant surrendering body heat to the earth. Now hides insulated them, keeping warmth where it belonged. Babies were wrapped tightly, their bodies shielded from the night air. Hunters tied hides around their legs to prevent the cold from seeping through their muscles. Elders whose bodies struggled most against winter often received the thickest furs. A single hide could extend life, delay death, and buy another day of endurance. Not every group embraced the same methods. Some developed heavy hooded cloaks, others stitched together layers into crude trousers and boots. Some fashioned mitts from small animal skins. Each innovation added a new barrier against the cold. Winter remained merciless, but the gap between the prepared and the unprepared widened each year. Those who adapted survived. Those who did not vanished, leaving behind no mark except scattered bones and tools frozen in time. Animal hides also created a subtle psychological shift. Wrapped in something warm, people could move farther from their fires, stay out longer, and face stronger winds. Tasks that once felt impossible became manageable. Hides did not make winter safe. They made it survivable, and survival allowed for learning, teaching, and refining. Skills are passed through generations, each adding a small improvement. Over time, hides became more than warmth. They became memory. A preserved fur carried the knowledge of the hunt, the labor of preparation, and the determination of those who refused to let the cold decide their fate. But even the best hides had limitations. If they became soaked, they turned heavy. If they froze, they stiffened. If they tore, they exposed skin to the wind. Winter punished any weakness. People learned to repair their clothing constantly, stitching with bone needles and sinew threads. They carried hides across long migrations, sometimes wearing them until they fell apart. Every winter tested the durability of their work and the depth of their skill. I often think that the first true expression of human ingenuity was not a weapon or a tool, but the simple realization that another creature's warmth could be borrowed for a while. Through hides, humans gained mobility, endurance, and a small measure of control over a world that cared nothing for their survival. Wrapped in the fur of beasts, they moved through landscapes that once would have destroyed them. The cold remained relentless, but now it had to work harder to claim them. The comfort hides provided were fragile, always shrinking beneath the weight of deeper winter. A harsher challenge waited where shelter thinned and wind carved through the land without mercy. From that exposed threshold, their struggle against the cold revealed new burdens they could not yet foresee. Shelter was never merely a place to rest. In prehistoric winters, it was the thin and brittle edge between endurance and disappearance. As temperatures dropped and storms gathered, humans were forced to confront a truth older than language itself. No one survived the cold without somewhere for the wind to break against. The world outside their walls, if they could even be called walls, was a shifting landscape of ice, darkness, and silence. Inside, there was only the faint hope that their fragile shelters would hold long enough. Caves became the most reliable refuge, not because they were comfortable, but because they offered what the winter rarely allowed: stillness. A cave's stone walls trapped warmth from fire, preserved the heat of many bodies, pressed close together, and shielded them from winds that cut through fur and bone alike. Yet caves were not chosen at random. Some were too damp, letting moisture seep into bedding. Others funneled cold air inward like a natural chimney. Many were already claimed by animals far stronger and less willing to share. Selecting the right cave required experience, memory, and the willingness to observe every detail before stepping inside. Not all groups had access to caves. Those who lived on open plains or in regions with few natural shelters learned to build crude snow shelters, simple structures that offered surprising insulation. Snow, when packed correctly, held heat. Bodies could warm the interior slowly, turning it from a fragile dome into a temporary sanctuary. Carving these shelters took time, and the work numbed fingers almost immediately. But when the wind screamed across the land and the world vanished behind walls of white, these makeshift structures saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. It is almost comical to imagine modern people attempting the same task, convinced by survival. Shows that improvising shelter is somehow straightforward rather than a desperate negotiation with the elements. Choosing where to build was as important as building itself. Wind was the enemy, relentless, slicing, merciless. Prehistoric humans learned to look for natural barriers, boulders, clusters of trees, curves in the land that redirected the air's aggression. A shelter, placed in the wrong spot, could collapse under snowdrifts, or allow cold to seep through gaps, too small to notice until it was too late. They read the land like a warning, studying how snow piled, how shadows shifted, how frost clung to certain surfaces more than others. Survival depended on guessing correctly. The work of construction demanded constant movement. Gathering branches, stones, and hides kept them warm for brief bursts, but the moment they stopped, the cold reclaimed their bodies. Smoke from their fires clung to the ceilings of caves, staining them black, and the smell of burning wood mixed with the sharpness of melting snow. Some shelters grew cramped quickly, especially when many bodies were pressed together. But space was a luxury the winter did not allow. The goal was not comfort, the goal was endurance. Inside these shelters, every breath mattered. Warm air rose, cold air sank. People positioned themselves carefully, placing elders and children closest to the fire or the warmest spot in the structure. Even small shifts in where someone slept could influence who woke up shivering and who woke up unable to feel their fingers. If someone today stepped into one of those shelters, they would likely understand how survival often depended on nothing more than intelligent positioning and the will to endure discomfort. Despite their efforts, shelters were fragile. A single storm could undo hours of preparation. Snow could cave in roofs. Moisture could weaken supports. Fires could fill enclosed spaces with smoke, forcing people to choose between suffocation and freezing. Even caves were not perfect. Predators sometimes entered in search of warmth or food. Humans slept lightly, waking at the slightest sound, always aware that disaster could strike from inside or out. Shelters also influenced the rhythm of daily life. Inside, people repaired tools, softened hides, shared food, and wrapped themselves in layers of fur. They listened to the wind, batter the walls, each gust, reminding them how thin the barrier truly was. Nights felt long, stretching across hours that were impossible to measure. Stories were whispered, not for entertainment, but for reassurance, a reminder that someone was awake, someone was tending the fire, someone was listening for signs of danger. Some groups built stone windbreaks outside cave entrances, stacking rocks into low walls that redirected currents of air. Others used branches and hides to reinforce openings, creating layers that trapped heat. Children learned early how to spot weak points in a shelter. Adults carried the responsibility of repairing damage before it grew too severe. Everyone participated because the alternative, waiting for someone else to fix what the cold was determined to break, was unthinkable. Certain shelters became temporary homes for weeks at a time. Snow piled at the entrance, muting the world. Fires burned low to conserve fuel. People rationed warmth the way they rationed food. Leaving the shelter was dangerous, but staying inside too long risked stagnation, sickness, and dwindling supplies. Even in safety, winter exacted its toll. I often think that these shelters, dark, cramped, imperfect, were perhaps the first expressions of human defiance, proof that even in a world hostile to their existence, they refused to surrender quietly. Shelter alone did not guarantee survival, but without it, survival was impossible. In these small, carefully chosen sanctuaries, prehistoric humans faced the cold, not as conquerors, but as fragile beings, clinging to the narrow space between warmth and oblivion. Every wall they built, every hide they stretched, every stone they positioned, became part of that ongoing struggle, an effort to create a place where life could continue even if only a little longer. Their makeshift walls held back the cold, but only for those who understood how to keep the darkness at bay. Another challenge waited beyond those narrow entrances, pressing against every decision they made. In that tightening world of frost and wind, survival demanded more than shelter alone. Sleep in prehistoric winters was never restful. It was a negotiation, a fragile pause in the long struggle against the cold. Night reduced the world to a narrow circle of breath and darkness. And within that circle, humans tried to hold on to warmth for a few hours at a time. How they slept determined who endured until morning, and who slipped quietly into the deeper stillness that winter offered without mercy. Rest was not a luxury. It was another battleground. Bodies curled tightly, instinctively, folding inward to trap what little heat they possessed. The posture was not comfortable, but comfort had no place in a season where survival outweighed ease. Muscles stiffened, joints ached, and breathing grew shallow. Yet curling close preserved warmth, and warmth preserved life. People tucked dried leaves or grasses around themselves, filling gaps where the cold might intrude. These makeshift insulators rustled beneath their weight, releasing faint, earthy scents that mixed with smoke and damp fur. Though simple, the method worked. The leaves formed pockets of air that slowed the escape of heat. It is almost funny that something as ordinary as a handful of dead leaves achieved what no amount of blankets could have provided in those early winters. Children were the most vulnerable. Their bodies lost heat quickly, their breaths turned frosty faster, and their limbs stiffened easily. To protect them, adults placed them at the center of the sleeping group, where layers of warmth overlapped. The arrangement resembled the rings of a tree, the young in the core, the strongest at the outer edge. The elderly tucked near the fire where steady heat might compensate for frail bodies. No one questioned the placement. It was the quiet logic of survival, a rule written by necessity rather than authority. A child who slept at the edge risked never waking again. Heat stones added another layer of defense. Heated near the fire and wrapped in hides, they were placed beside sleepers to radiate warmth throughout the night. The stones cooled slowly, releasing heat in a steady, comforting pulse. Carrying them was difficult. Dropping one could trigger a burn or shatter the stone into sharp fragments. Yet the effort was worth it. A warm stone could mean the difference between shivering through the night and slipping into the numb exhaustion that signaled the beginning of hypothermia. If someone today were handed a single warm stone and told it was their only source of comfort for the night, they might finally understand how thin the line between warmth and loss once was. But nothing about sleep in those winters was predictable. The fire that warmed the stones could fade without warning. Someone might roll away from the group, losing precious heat. A sudden gust could slip through cracks in the shelter and extinguish embers. Sleep was shallow, easily broken, and often interrupted by murmurs of discomfort or the shifting weight of others seeking warmth. People learned to wake quickly to tend the fire, without fully rising to adjust leaves and hides with practiced movements. Some slept with their backs to one another, sharing warmth along their spines where heat escaped fastest. Others layered hides over their entire group, creating a crude but effective cocoon. Children often clung to adults in their sleep, their small hands seeking warmth even in unconscious moments. The cold shaped every posture, every breath, every gesture of the night. Rest became a collective ritual. No one slept alone, no one slept carelessly. The ground itself was a threat. Earth pulled heat downward, draining the body even through fur and leaves. To counter this, people built raised bedding from branches, stones, or layers of hides. Even a few inches made a significant difference. Night after night, they experimented with new methods, more leaves, thicker hides, different arrangements of bodies, until they found combinations that kept the cold at bay long enough for the sun to rise again. Sleep was not stagnant. It was a skill refined through suffering and observation. Winter nights carried dangers beyond cold. Predators prowled in silence. Storms sometimes collapsed parts of shelters. Sick members of the group moaned or convulsed, their weakened bodies unable to generate heat. The healthy woke, often checking on those who might slip into the irreversible stillness of freezing. A single night could claim lives, even without an external threat. Humans learned to fear quietness, to distrust peace, to understand that a still body was not always a sleeping one. Despite these conditions, sleep remained essential. Without it, minds dulled, reflexes slowed, and mistakes multiplied. A tired hunter lost accuracy. A tired firekeeper risked letting the flames die. Fatigue made the cold heavier, the world sharper, the dangers faster. So they persisted in this nightly ritual of gathering, curling, pressing close. In the soft glow of embers, their silhouettes formed shapes of endurance bodies, arranging themselves not for comfort, but for survival. I often think that these ancient sleeping circles were the earliest expressions of human solidarity, born not from choice, but from the simple need to share warmth in a world that offered none. Every night was a reminder that isolation meant death. Together they retained heat, strength, and hope. Wrapped in fur, surrounded by leaves, pressed tightly against one another, they carved small islands of warmth into a landscape determined to smother them. Winter tried to steal their breath, but sleep, fragile, imperfect, restless, helped them endure until morning. Their nights of shared warmth kept the cold at a distance, but only just. Another demand waited in the daylight, shifting their struggle toward the hunger that winter always carried. From that slow erosion of strength, a harsher survival lesson would soon emerge. Infancy in prehistoric winters existed on the thinnest possible threshold between breath and silence. The cold pressed hardest against the smallest bodies, stealing warmth faster than any adult could replace it. A newborn's life hung in fragile conditions, the heat of a fire that might flicker out the milk of a mother, weakened by hunger, the shelter that blocked the wind only when luck cooperated. Winter was not simply a season, it was a judgment, and the youngest were always judged first. The mortality of infants was not measured in numbers. It was measured in the quiet spaces left behind when a small cry faded too soon. Their lungs were delicate, making each inhale a struggle against air that sliced rather than soothed. Their skin cooled rapidly, turning pale or mottled within minutes. Even wrapped in furs and pressed between warm bodies, a newborn could slip into hypothermia before anyone realized what was happening. It is almost grimly ironic that today people debate the ideal room temperature for babies, while their distant ancestors fought to keep them alive in conditions no modern nursery could simulate. Food scarcity carved deep lines into these early losses. Mothers weakened by constant cold and insufficient calories produced little milk. What they did have often went to the strongest infants first, an instinctive, unspoken decision shaped by the harsh arithmetic of survival. When food was rationed, infants, whose cries grew faint, were quietly understood to be slipping beyond reach. Even the healthiest newborns struggled when the group's stores dwindled. Hunger hollowed the adults, and that hollowness flowed inevitably down to the children they were trying to protect. Temperature worked to parallel cruelty. Fires did not burn steadily through long nights. Embers sank unpredictably. A storm could choke a cave entrance, or push icy air through the smallest gaps. Adults who slept too deeply allowed cold pockets to form in the center of the sleeping circle where infants lay. A shift in position, a drifting hide or a fallen leaf barrier, could reduce a child's chance of survival without a sound. Parents learned to wake repeatedly, touching their children to feel whether their skin still held warmth or had already begun to cool. Some groups attempted rituals or practices to protect their youngest. They wrapped infants in the thickest hides, placed them nearest heated stones, or kept them against a mother's chest even during sleep. These strategies sometimes worked, but not consistently. The cold waited for the moments when vigilance wavered. Infants lacked the strength to shiver, a mechanism that helped adults generate heat. Without that defense, winter moved through them swiftly and silently. When a child fell ill, the signs appeared quickly: shallow breathing, limp limbs, the soft whimpering that signaled the body's failing fight. There were no medicines, no emergency remedies, no knowledge of diagnosis. Families did what they could, massaging small arms, feeding warm broth, and placing heated stones close to fragile bodies. But winter rarely released those it claimed. If someone today held one of those children, they might realize how survival once depended on conditions too unstable for any amount of care to control. The burden on the group stretched beyond emotion. Resources were never enough. A decision had to be made about how much warmth, food, and attention could be spent on a child whose chances were fading. These decisions were not voiced aloud. They simply emerged through actions. A fire might be stoked less often. A hide might be given to someone stronger. A parent might hold their infant closer, aware of what the others had quietly chosen. Love persisted, but love could not outweigh the cold. Some nights an infant slipped away in a mother's arms. Other times, the morning revealed the stillness that darkness had hidden. The group mourned, but not through wailing or ceremony. They mourned through the slow, resigned movements of people who had seen such loss before and knew it would come again. Grief became another layer of winter, settling over them like frost. And yet this harshness bred a kind of resilience. The children who survived their first winter often grew stronger, shaped by conditions that demanded every possible adaptation. These children became the ones who learned to hunt earlier, to read storms, to build shelters, to guard the fire. They carried the memory of cold even into seasons of warmth, and that memory shaped their actions long before language shaped their thoughts. The repeated loss of infants influenced group dynamics as well. Women who had lost children shared knowledge with others about how to position bodies at night, or how to recognize early signs of hypothermia. Men hunted farther, risking injury, knowing that every calorie counted. Elders whispered stories that kept hope flickering even when winter pressed hard against the entrance of their shelters. In a world where new life struggled to survive, every member felt responsible for guarding what little promise the future held. I often think that the quiet courage of these parents, caring for infants in conditions that offered no mercy, was one of the earliest forms of human endurance, carved into their lives by winter's relentless demands. Winter took many things, but it never took humanity's stubborn refusal to surrender. Each child born into the cold carried a fragile promise, a reminder that life could still push forward against overwhelming odds. Some did not survive their first night, but those who did became living proof that even the coldest season could not erase hope entirely. Their smallest members suffered the deepest wounds of winter, yet the struggle did not end with loss. Another test waited in the hunger that crept closer with each passing day. Within that quiet erosion of strength, survival revealed its cost once more. Food in prehistoric winters was not about taste preference or abundance. It was about heat, about finding the dense, sustaining fuel that kept the body from collapsing into the cold. Every choice humans made during these long months revolved around a simple question: would this food keep us alive? The snow-covered world offered nothing green, nothing soft, nothing easy. Only the bodies of animals held enough energy to push back against the winter that pressed on every breath. Fat was everything. It burned slowly in the body, releasing heat long after lean meat had been exhausted. Hunters sought animals with thick layers of fat beneath their hides, creatures that had survived autumn by storing energy for their own harsh season. These animals became lifelines. A successful kill meant warmth. A failed hunt meant shivering bodies, weakening limbs, and an encroaching sense of dread that settled as heavily as the snow outside their shelters. The richest parts of an animal were never the muscle. Marrow organs and sheets of fat carried a density that no other food could replace. Bones were cracked open with stones, releasing the warm, oily marrow inside a substance so vital that even children learned early how to scoop it out with their fingers. The liver and kidneys were roasted near the fire, their heat rising in plumes. The stomach lining the heart, the fat surrounding them, all of it mattered. Waste did not exist in a season where the cold consumed more energy than the body could spare. It is almost humorous that modern diets fear fat, when for ancient humans, it was the only thing that kept their bodies from surrendering to the cold. Protein alone was not enough. Lean meat filled the stomach, but offered little warmth. Too much of it without fat to balance could even weaken the body further. Hunters knew this instinctively. They prioritized animals heavy with stored energy, deer thickened by autumn feeding seals wrapped in blubber and bears, harboring fat reserves for hibernation. Killing such an animal was rare but transformative. Its body became a reservoir of survival stretched across days or weeks. Fat was rubbed on skin, melted into broth, mixed with dried meat and preserved in hides. Even the methods of eating reflected the urgency of survival. Meat was often consumed quickly after a kill, before freezing temperatures turned it into something too rigid to chew. They warmed pieces over the fire, letting fat drip onto stone and hiss into smoke. Organs were eaten first because they spoiled easily. Marrow-filled bones were saved for later, cracked and boiled when other food ran out. Nothing was eaten for enjoyment. Everything was eaten for heat. Children received the fattiest portions. Their bodies, still small and vulnerable, needed the extra warmth. Mothers chewed frozen pieces to soften them before feeding infants who were too weak to bite. Elders, whose bodies struggled to maintain temperature, were given broths enriched with melted fat. These decisions were not sentimental. They were strategic, ensuring that those who contributed most to group survival, or who required the most protection, received what the cold threatened to take from them. Food shortages created fractures in the group. If the hunt failed, the silence inside the shelter grew heavy. Hides stiffened. Fires crackled without cheer. People rationed portions, carefully aware that overeating on one day meant starving the next. Even with successful hunts, preservation was a constant challenge. Meat hung from cave ceilings, drying slowly in cold air. If a predator smelled it, the group risked attack. If the weather shifted suddenly, frozen meat could spoil. Any waste was a reminder that winter did not forgive mistakes. Water, too, played a quiet role. Melted snow cooled the body dangerously, so humans learned to warm it with stones or mix it with broth. Hot liquids restored a faint sense of strength. Cold liquids stole warmth more quickly than hunger did. Everything they consumed had to serve one purpose: sustaining heat. Hunger shaped their behavior. It sharpened their senses, forcing them to search for signs of animals in the snow, subtle patterns of movement, broken twigs, and faint tracks disappearing into the distance. Hunters returned with hands numb from gripping weapons, breath-shallow bodies trembling. Yet they carried food that radiated hope through the cave. For a moment, the group felt a flicker of relief, even if they knew it would not last. The cold's assault on the body was constant. Fat insulated, but it also fueled. People burned through it rapidly, their bodies working ceaselessly to generate heat. A day without food meant shivering through the night. 2 days meant losing feeling in fingers and toes. Longer than that, and the body slowed into a lethargy from which many never returned. I often think that prehistoric hunger was not simply an emptiness. It was a force, a presence, something that stalked them as relentlessly as any predator. Food tethered them to life. Every bite of marrow, every strip of fat, every sip of broth was a reminder that the cold had not yet consumed them. Their bodies warmed from within, allowing them to endure another hunt, another night, another storm. Winter remained powerful, but as long as humans could feed themselves, it could not claim them completely. Their struggle for warmth through food kept their bodies alive, but the cold still searched for new ways to break them. Another threat waited in the way their own skin met the frozen air. Amid that constant battle against the elements, survival demanded more than nourishment. Keeping warmth in prehistoric winters required more than fire and food. The cold pressed against the skin with a steady insistence, searching for any weakness, any gap where it could slip through. Humans had to defend their bodies directly, using whatever methods they discovered, through trial instinct, and the quiet desperation that winter carved into daily life. The strategies they created were simple, sometimes crude, but each one formed another thin shield between life and the freezing air. Animal fat became a vital barrier. People warmed it near the fire until it softened, then rubbed it onto their skin in thick layers. The grease-sealed pores trapped heat and repelled moisture that could chill them further. It left a strong smell and a glossy sheen on their bodies, but appearance meant nothing when warmth was at stake. The fat hardened in the cold, forming a flexible coating that slowed the loss of heat. Hunters often applied extra layers to their faces, hands, and feet, the areas most likely to freeze first. It is almost amusing that modern cosmetics boast about moisture barriers, while their early ancestors created their own version from whatever the hunt provided. Movement offered another defense. Remaining still allowed the cold to creep in, settling into limbs and stiffening joints. So people kept themselves in near constant motion. They walked, stretched, paced inside their shelters, or rhythmically stamped their feet on the ground. Even small movements helped maintain circulation. When tending the fire, they shifted positions often. When guarding the entrance of a cave, they rotated duties, so no one stood still too long. Children learned to mimic these habits early, shaking their arms and legs when they felt the sting of cold. Stillness was dangerous. Motion kept them alive. Water posed one of the greatest risks. Touching it drained the heat instantly. Even snow, if pressed against bare skin, could pull warmth away in moments. Because of this, prehistoric people avoided washing during winter unless necessary. Dirt did not matter. Survival did. If they needed to clean themselves, they used warmed stones to heat small amounts of water or wiped their skin with dry grasses. Bathing was reserved for warmer seasons. During winter, water was an enemy that could freeze fingers, crack skin, or lower the body's temperature beyond recovery. The cold also shaped their routines. Tasks that required exposure to the elements were completed quickly, with the group working in coordinated bursts of activity. Hunters checked each other for signs of frostbite skin, turning pale or waxy, and numb patches spreading across extremities. When these appeared, the affected person was rushed back to the shelter. Their hands or feet warmed slowly with body heat or heated stones. Too much heat, too quickly, caused more damage, something they learned through painful experience. Inside their shelters, they created small microclimates. People sat close, sharing breath-warmed air. Hides hung along cave walls to reduce drafts. Gaps in the stone were filled with mud leaves or even crushed bone to block the wind. The air grew heavy with smoke and moisture, but the trapped warmth outweighed the discomfort. They arranged sleeping areas away from the entrance, building layers of insulation beneath their bodies. The interior became a place where the cold was held back, not defeated, but kept at a manageable distance. Clothing itself played a crucial role. Furs were wrapped with the hair facing outward to repel snow. Multiple layers of hides trapped air between them, forming natural insulation. People tied the hides tightly at wrists, ankles, and necks to prevent heat from escaping. Children were swaddled until only their faces were exposed. Adults patched their clothing constantly, reinforcing tears with sinew or stripped fibers. A hole in clothing was not an inconvenience. It was a threat. Sometimes warmth came from unexpected sources. Lying near another person's body provided a slow, steady heat that neither fire nor clothing could fully replace. Hunters returning from long expeditions often slept beside the group's warmest individuals, letting their chilled bodies recover. Babies, elders, and injured members were always placed in the warmest spots. Touch itself became a tool of survival, a quiet reminder that humans relied on one another long before language shaped their relationships. The cold never fully withdrew. Even with fat-coated skin, layers of hides, constant movement, and shared warmth, humans endured a persistent chill that settled into their bones. It narrowed their world to the space they could keep warm and the tasks they could complete before numbness crept in. Yet through countless winters, they refined their techniques, passing down knowledge through observation, how to treat frozen skin, when to move, how to seal a shelter, how to protect the warmth that flickered inside their bodies. I often think that these early strategies, though primitive, formed the beginning of humanity's long effort to master the environment. A quiet resilience, shaped not by tools alone, but by stubborn, persistent adaptation. Warmth became more than a need. It became a skill. The prehistoric body learned to endure cold, not through comfort, but through deliberate actions that pushed back against winter's constant pressure. Every season taught them something new. Every storm reminded them of what they risked. And every breath taken in the cold was a victory that carried them one step further into survival. Their bodies held on to warmth through effort and instinct, yet the world outside still threatened that fragile balance. Another source of heat waited in the flames that shaped their nights and guarded their homes. Through that glow of survival, a deeper story of fire began to unfold. Fire was not guaranteed in prehistoric winters. It had to be found, borrowed, coaxed into existence, or stolen from the world whenever nature chose to offer it. The flames that warmed their shelters, cooked their food, dried their hides, and protected their bodies were never taken for granted. Fire was a fragile companion, one that demanded constant attention because it could vanish in a moment, leaving only darkness and cold behind. Before humans learned to create sparks reliably, they searched for natural sources of flame. Wildfires ignited by lightning were among the first opportunities. When storms swept across the land and struck dry brush, people watched the horizon for the rising glow. Approaching such fires was dangerous. Smoke-blinded embers flew unpredictably, and collapsing branches turned the landscape into a shifting trap. But a burning branch carried back to camp could mean survival. Groups sometimes waited at the edges of scorched ground, gathering embers or hot stones, moving quickly before the heat faded. Children were forbidden to come near. Even adults trembled at the risks. Volcanic activity offered another gift. When lava flowed or vents released heat, people collected burning material from a safe distance. They learned to approach cautiously, guided by experience rather than knowledge. The heat could sear skin instantly, and toxic fumes drifted invisibly. Yet the promise of fire pushed them forward. A smouldering fragment of wood taken from a volcanic field might burn for hours, giving the group time to kindle a more stable flame back in their shelter. Eventually, humans discovered how to strike fire from stone. Flint and pyrite, when hit together, produced bright sparks that leapt into the air. These sparks were tiny, delicate, and short-lived, but with enough patience they could ignite dry tinder. The process demanded steady hands and a calm mind, qualities difficult to maintain in freezing temperatures. Sparks died easily in the wind. Damp materials refused to catch. Even when the spark succeeded, it grew slowly, a faint orange glow that needed to be fed with careful breath and thin fibers. Watching that glow expand into flame created a quiet sense of triumph, one that echoed through generations. It is strangely fitting that something so essential to early survival came from the simple collision of two ordinary stones. But creating fire was only the beginning. Keeping it alive required vigilance. Someone always tended the flames even through the darkest hours of night. The role often fell to the young or the elderly, those who lacked the strength for long hunts but could still guard embers with devotion. They added small pieces of wood, stirred coals, and shielded the fire when winds rose. If the flame dimmed, they blew gently to revive it. If sparks scattered, they pressed them back into place. Firekeepers became quiet guardians of survival, their eyes reflecting the glow that warmed everyone else. Losing the fire meant more than darkness. It meant returning to the uncertainty of finding a new source, or spending hours trying to reignite a spark in conditions that rarely cooperated. Cold fingers struggled to grip stones, snow-soaked tinder. Winds stole sparks before they touched the ground. A failed attempt could mean days without warmth, without cooked food, without the comfort of light. Fear of losing the flame shaped their daily routines. They stored embers in dried fungus, or wrapped them in bark to transport them safely. They built windbreaks to protect their hearth. They taught children never to play near the fire, never to waste wood, never to turn their backs on the embers. Fire became more than a tool, it became a presence in their lives. In many groups, it was treated as a living force, something to be respected and watched over. They whispered around it, shared stories, warmed their hands in its glow. It dried their clothing after storms, cured meat for winter stores, and hardened wooden tools. It scared away predators whose eyes gleamed at the edge of the dark. The crackling sound became familiar, a soft reassurance in a world full of harsh noise and shifting dangers. Inside the shelter, the fire created a narrow island of comfort. Beyond its reach, shadows deepened and cold gathered. People huddled close, letting the warmth seep into their bones. They arranged stones to reflect heat, placed hides near the flames to soften them, and dried grasses overhead to prevent mold. The hearth was the center of their winter existence. Without it, life unraveled quickly. Fire also shaped their movements. Hunters sometimes carried smoldering sticks, wrapped in bark to light new fires during long journeys. Campsites were chosen based on available fuel, fallen branches, dead trees, and dry shrubs. When supplies ran low, the group traveled to new areas, guided by the knowledge that fire needed to be fed just as they did. It was a shared responsibility, a quiet agreement that no one would let the flame die on their watch. Even with all this care, fire remained unpredictable. A gust of wind could scatter embers. A misplaced hide could smother flames. A sudden snowfall could extinguish a carefully protected fire. Every loss felt personal, a reminder of nature's dominance, and every successful ignition felt like a small defiance of the cold that sought to consume them. I sometimes imagine the relief they felt when a spark caught the flames rising slowly into something strong enough to warm a family, their breath visible in the glow as they realized they had bought themselves another day. Fire marked the line between life and death, comfort and suffering, hope and despair. Each flame burned with the effort of countless hands, the patience of countless attempts, and the unspoken knowledge that winter did not forgive failure. Through fire, humans carved a fragile sanctuary in a world that pressed endlessly against them. Their flames pushed back the cold, yet the burden of tending them never eased. Another challenge crept into their shelters, testing their endurance through the long nights. Beyond those flickering embers, survival demanded a new way of holding warmth close. Warmth in prehistoric winters depended on a single fragile source, and its absence could unravel everything a group had worked to preserve. The glow inside their shelters was the thin boundary, separating endurance from collapse. When the flames weakened, fear settled quickly. When they died, the cold rushed in with a force that stripped heat from every body, leaving no time to hesitate. A single lapse of attention could destroy the fragile stability they fought to maintain. The responsibility for preserving that warmth fell to the firekeeper, an essential figure whose task demanded precision and constant awareness. Their duty was not glamorous, but it carried weight heavier than that of hunters or gatherers. They monitored embers, fed small sticks to coax flames upward, shielded the hearth from sudden gusts of wind, and rearranged wood so heat remained steady through long, unforgiving nights. This role required patience, steady hands, and an instinctive understanding of how fire behaved. It is strangely fitting that one of the most critical jobs in a harsh winter belonged to someone whose strength came not from muscle but from unwavering attention. Children sometimes took this role. Their smaller bodies tolerated the heat more easily, and their quick eyes noticed changes in the embers before adults did. They learned to judge when wood needed turning, when smoke hinted at suffocation, when sparks could threaten to die out. Though young, they carried a responsibility that shaped their sense of belonging. Sitting near the hearth wrapped in hides, they guarded the flames with a seriousness rarely found in childhood today. The threat of losing the flame lingered constantly. Embers dimmed without warning. Wood sometimes snapped in ways that smothered the core of the fire. Moisture trapped inside logs created sudden bursts of steam that scattered sparks. Even a brief moment of distraction could allow the flames to slip into darkness. Fear of this possibility shaped their routines. Nights were divided into watches, embers were stirred rhythmically, and dry materials were kept close at hand in case the fire needed urgent revival. If the flame died entirely, panic followed. The shelter filled with air that chilled breath and stiffened fingers within seconds. People tried striking flint and pyrite, sending weak sparks into nests of dried grass. But the cold made hands clumsy and tinder fragile. Sparks faded before catching. Fatigue made each strike weaker than the last. The group could sense the danger tightening around them. Without fire, food could not be cooked, heat could not be shared, and the cold would pull strength from their bodies too quickly to recover. When relighting efforts failed, someone had to leave the shelter and seek help. This journey through frozen terrain became a race against time. Wrapped in hides, stiffened by frost, the messenger moved through deep snow and cutting wind. Their breath crystallized as they walked, their vision blurred from cold tearing at the corners of their eyes. Still, they pressed on, knowing that returning empty-handed meant returning to a silent shelter filled with people who would not live through the night. Reaching another group did not always guarantee success. Some clans protected their flame, fiercely viewing it as the core of their own survival. Others shared it willingly, understanding the mutual vulnerability of winter. The exchange required no words. A burning branch held out a nod of understanding, a moment where survival transcended clan boundaries. Carrying the fragile flame back home became an act of careful reverence, each gust of wind, a threat each step, a quiet plea for the ember to endure. When the messenger finally returned, relief washed through the shelter. People gathered quickly, warming their hands near the borrowed flame. The firekeeper resumed, their position shaken but determined not to repeat the failure. The revived flame restored more than heat. It restored hope, rhythm, and the fragile sense of continuity that winter constantly threatened to break. Inside the shelter, the hearth remained the center of life. People oriented their tasks around it, drying hides, roasting meat, warming cold, stiffened tools. Children played near its edge, always watched closely to prevent accidents. Elders leaned close, drawing heat into bones weakened by age. Hunters shared stories under its glow, letting the warmth loosen muscles tight from exhaustion. Every aspect of their existence circled back to this fragile source of light. The firekeeper, though often overlooked in strength-based tasks, held a status of quiet respect. Their vigilance allowed the group to sleep, eat, and work without constant fear. Failure was rare, but when it happened, it carved itself into memory. reminding everyone of the precarious balance they lived within. Their skill was not in creating fire, but in preventing its disappearance. Cold nights amplified this dependence. Winds howled outside, carrying flakes of ice through cracks in stone and hide. Shadows flickered along cave walls. The fire rumbled quietly, shrinking and expanding in uneven rhythms. Every eye followed its movements, measuring its health by color and intensity. Those hours were tense, as if winter itself waited just outside, ready to rush in at the slightest opportunity. I sometimes imagine the weight that settled on the shoulders of those who guarded the flames, their faces lit by the orange glow, knowing that every heartbeat of the group relied on their steady hands. Winter tested every member of the clan, but it tested the fire most of all. And the firekeeper stood between that fragile line of survival and the silent cold pressing against the world beyond their walls. Their guarded flames shaped the rhythm of their nights, yet even a stable fire could not keep every shiver away. Another effort emerged inside their shelters, altering the way they trapped warmth beneath their bodies. Through those quiet adjustments, insulation became the next defense against the cold. Shelter alone could not protect prehistoric people from the cold that crept upward from the ground, seeped downward from cave ceilings, and pressed inward from every exposed surface. The cold had weight moving slowly through stone and soil until it reached the bodies of those trying to rest. So they learned to reshape the spaces where they slept, forming layers of insulation that pushed back against the elements. These adjustments were not elaborate, but each one carried the hard-earned knowledge of winters that had claimed lives before they fully understood how to defend themselves. The first layer of protection came from the earth itself, but not in its natural state. Bare ground drains heat rapidly, pulling warmth from bodies through constant contact. To counter this, people laid down thick carpets of dried grasses, leaves, and occasionally warm ashes collected from the hearth. The materials rustled beneath them, forming a cushion that trapped small pockets of air. These pockets slowed the escape of heat and softened the chill that radiated upward. Grass was chosen for its springiness, leaves for their layering potential, and ashes for the soft warmth they retained, even after cooling. It is almost funny to realize that these early techniques resemble modern insulation principles, though they were discovered not through science, but through sheer need. Over time, they learned to raise their sleeping platforms. Even a small elevation made a surprising difference. They built layers of branches, stones, or hardened soil, then covered the surface with hides. The height did not need to be great, just enough to lift their bodies away from the coldest part of the ground. Elevated bedding also helped prevent moisture from soaking into hides or furs. Dampness was as dangerous as cold itself. Moisture clung to bodies, intensified heat loss, and encouraged illness. A dry sleeping space could mean the difference between enduring winter and succumbing to it. Shelters were also reshaped from above. Many caves or constructed huts had ceilings too high to trap warmth effectively. Heat rose and collected uselessly overhead, leaving the living space cold. To solve this, people lowered the interior with hides, woven branches, or animal skins stretched across supporting poles. These makeshift ceilings forced warmth downward, concentrating it where bodies rested. Smoke from the fire also accumulated beneath these lowered coverings, creating a hazy warmth that irritated the eyes but protected the body. Survival often meant choosing discomfort over danger. Insulation expanded outward as well. Walls of shelters were packed with grasses, mud, and layers of bark to thicken them. Narrow cracks were sealed with clay or moss. Every breath of cold air that slipped through felt like an invasion, a reminder that the world outside still pushed relentlessly against their small refuge. Blocked cracks also reduced drafts that could extinguish the fire, so insulation served multiple purposes at once. Sleeping arrangements were the final layer of warmth. Individuals did not sleep scattered, but grouped tightly in formations that maximized shared heat. Adults positioned themselves at the outer edges, forming a human barrier around the most vulnerable. Children and the elderly rested toward the center, where the warmth of multiple bodies converged. These sleeping clusters were adjusted throughout the night as people shifted, woke, or tended the fire. They acted as living insulation, as essential to survival as any material placed beneath them. The methods of improving insulation grew more refined as humans observed their environment. They noticed how certain animals built dens insulated with leaves or fur. They learned which plants stayed dry longest, which mosses repelled moisture, and which woods trapped heat when burned inside the shelter. They experimented constantly, adding new layers, rearranging bedding, shifting the fire, and lowering ceilings further. Each winter became a lesson that shaped the next. Moisture control remained a constant battle. Melted snow tracked into the shelter had to be removed immediately. If water seeped beneath their bedding, they tore up the layers and replaced them before sleeping. Trodden grass flattened quickly under repeated use, so bedding required frequent replenishment. They carried bundles of new grasses from outside whenever the weather allowed. The repetitive nature of these tasks did not frustrate them. It reminded them that each action saved energy their bodies would have lost otherwise. Shelters took on a lived-in warmth that contrasted sharply with the world outside. The air grew thick with smoke and breath. Walls darkened from soot. The ceiling sagged with the weight of hides and branches. Despite these signs of wear, the interior became a sanctuary in winter storms. People crawled inside after long days in the cold, their fingers stiff and faces numb, and felt the insulating layers cradle them. The heat they preserved lingered even after the fire died down. It was never enough to be comfortable, but it was enough to endure. I often think that these early sleeping spaces with their layered grasses, lowered ceilings, and tightly gathered bodies reflect a quiet ingenuity, proof that survival was built not only through strength but through the careful shaping of the small world they could control. Their insulation techniques did not erase the cold, but they softened its bite. The warmth they kept within their shelters formed a boundary that the winter constantly tried to breach. And each night, they lay down surrounded by these layers. They were reminded that survival relied not only on fire and food, but on creating spaces where warmth could settle and stay. Their shelters held the warmth a little longer, yet the cold outside still pressed hard against their fragile barriers. Another element of survival emerged from the bond that formed among those who shared these spaces. Amid that closeness, the struggle against winter gained a deeper sense of unity. Survival in prehistoric winters was never an individual achievement. Cold had a way of exposing the limits of solitary endurance, stripping away warmth, food, and strength, until only collective effort could create the conditions necessary to live. A single person might keep a fire alive or build a shelter, but only a community could maintain the warmth, resources, and emotional resilience required to endure months of biting wind and frozen ground. In this harsh season, the bonds between people were as essential as fire itself. Sleeping close together was one of the earliest and most instinctive strategies. Bodies produced heat constantly, and when multiple bodies pressed together, that warmth pooled rather than dissipated. Adults arranged themselves strategically, forming protective layers around the young, the sick, and the elderly. At night, these sleeping clusters shifted slowly as individuals adjusted for comfort or woke to tend the fire. The shared heat softened the cold air and lowered the chance of hypothermia. It is almost humorous that modern humans buy specialized blankets and heating devices, while their ancestors relied simply on the warmth of another person lying inches away. Sharing clothing and food followed naturally from this closeness. When supplies ran low, the strongest individuals, those who could endure temporary deprivation, gave their extra portions to those whose survival depended on immediate nourishment. Warm hides were draped over shivering children, while adults tightened their belts and stepped closer to the fire to make up for the loss. These acts were not gestures of charity. They were strategies rooted in deep understanding. A weak member threatened the entire group's future. Protecting them strengthened the whole. Food sharing also created an invisible safety net. Hunters returned from the cold with their catches, and the group divided the meat carefully. Fatty portions went to those who needed warmth the most. Organ meats were cooked quickly for the elders, who struggled to maintain body temperature. Leftover bones became tools or fuel. Nothing was wasted, and nothing belonged solely to one person. In the harsh math of winter, resources were strongest when pooled. Clothing, particularly fur and hide garments, circulated through the group. If someone fell ill, their clothing was redistributed to keep them warm enough to recover. Hunters used extra layers on particularly cold days, then passed them back to others when the danger had passed. Children wore garments that had belonged to older siblings, stitched and repaired repeatedly until the material gave out. Clothing was not a possession. It was a communal asset that moved according to need. But physical survival was only part of the community's role. Winter also pressed on the mind, weighing it with darkness, confinement, and the constant threat of loss. To counter this, elders told stories. These stories were not entertainment. They were anchors. They reminded the group of past winters survived of ancestors who had endured colder nights and harsher storms. The tales shaped identity and strengthened resolve. Elders spoke of migrations, hunts, lessons learned from failure, and the quiet persistence that allowed their people to live another season. Their voices steadied the hearts of those who listened. Children gathered close to hear the stories, their faces lit by firelight, their breath visible in the dim shelter. Adults listened as well, taking solace in the rhythm of familiar words. The stories reinforced bonds, bridging generations, and linking individual struggles to a shared lineage of survival. Even in grief, storytelling helped restore hope. When a loved one died, elders spoke of cycles' renewal and the enduring line of life. These words softened the blow of winter's harshest moments. Tasks within the group were divided according to ability. Strong hunters ventured into the cold. Skilled crafters repaired tools and clothing. Caregivers tended to the sick and prepared food. Children assisted by gathering small branches or watching the fire. Each role mattered, and each person understood the weight they carried. There was no idle presence. Winter demanded that everyone contribute to the fragile balance that kept their group alive. This interdependence shaped their behavior. Acts of selfishness were remembered and corrected quickly, not through punishment, but through subtle shifts in responsibility and trust. Cooperation became a form of instinct, reinforced through generations of shared hardship. Individuals learned early that their survival was tied to the survival of others. The cold tested them often, and each test deepened their reliance on community. Even small gestures carried meaning. A hand offering a warmed stone, a hide thrown over the shoulders of someone shivering. A piece of dried meat was passed to a hungry child. These actions built a sense of unity that made winter feel less like an enemy pressing against individuals and more like a challenge faced by a single cohesive group. I often think that the warmth inside those shelters came not only from fire or hides, but from the quiet, persistent connection between people who understood that winter spared no one alone. Community did not erase danger, but it transformed it. Through shared heat, shared food, shared stories, and shared burdens, humans learned that survival required more than endurance. It required trust, cooperation, and the steady presence of others who refused to let the cold break their collective spirit. Their unity held them together through the longest nights yet. The world beyond their shelter still offered lessons in survival. Another source of inspiration came from the creatures that endured the same cold in silence. Among those silent teachers, new strategies began to take shape. Prehistoric humans did not face winter alone. The world around them, harsh, unforgiving, and stripped bare by snow, remained alive with creatures that had endured the cold long before humans learned how to survive it. Animals moved through winter with a kind of silent mastery, each species carrying instincts shaped by generations of adaptation. Humans watched them closely. Observation became a tool, and imitation became a strategy that quietly reshaped their understanding of endurance. The first lessons came from large mammals, especially bears. When humans saw bears retreat into dens and seemingly vanish for months, they recognized a pattern. The animals grew fat during warmer seasons, storing energy not for strength but for stillness. Their bodies slowed, conserving warmth and calories while the world froze outside. Humans could not hibernate, but they learned the value of reducing movement, staying sheltered longer, and conserving calories when food became scarce. It is almost striking that some of the earliest human survival strategies emerged not from invention, but from quietly watching a creature sleep. They also studied predators, such as foxes and wolves. These animals built or found dens insulated with layers of leaves, moss, and soil. Their dens were small, just large enough to trap body heat. Humans took note. Large, drafty spaces could not hold warmth. Smaller shelters kept warmth concentrated. People began to narrow the entrances of their caves with stone hide or branches. They learned to create low ceilings, much like the protected chambers wolves dug beneath roots. The animals had unintentionally demonstrated that size was the enemy of warmth. Foxes and wolves also showed how to position dens relative to the wind. Predators often chose slopes that shielded them from the harshest gusts, or areas where natural barriers blocked drafts. Humans mirrored this instinct. They built windbreaks using stacked rocks or woven branches. Some shifted their sleeping positions so that their backs faced the incoming wind, just as wolves curled with their tails covering their noses. Every detail mattered when winter pressed so heavily against their bodies. Birds, too, offered unexpected guidance. Their nests layered grasses, feathers, and flexible twigs into shapes that repelled moisture and retained heat. Humans began to experiment with similar layering leaves beneath hides, grasses under bedding, and woven mats that imitated the structure of nests. They discovered that layering materials of different textures created more stable insulation. The idea that warmth could be built rather than simply found marked a shift in their thinking, one inspired by creatures far smaller than themselves. From migratory animals, humans learned the value of movement. Herds traveled great distances when seasonal changes signaled danger. Though humans could not travel as swiftly or as fearlessly, they recognized patterns. When certain animals moved south, food and safer climates often waited in that direction. When birds gathered in groups before taking flight, it meant storms or colder days ahead. Humans read these signs, using them as early warning systems. They adjusted their hunts, their shelters, and their diets accordingly. Even insects provided insights. Some species burrowed beneath soil or hid in crevices, waiting out the cold in tiny protected pockets. Humans adapted this idea by creating storage pits, lined with insulating materials to keep food from freezing too quickly. They also recognized the value of staying close to warm rocks at night, the same instinct that reptiles use when seeking heated surfaces during cold hours. Observing nature also revealed something deeper. Survival was not about resisting the cold with force, but about working with the environment. Animals did not challenge winter, they adapted to it. Humans began to imitate this calm acceptance, reshaping their daily rhythms. They spent more time indoors, conserved energy, and relied on communal warmth. They watched how predators conserved motion, how prey animals hid, and how birds selected sheltered branches. Each observation added another thread to the fabric of their survival. The lessons extended beyond physical techniques. Watching animals endure helped humans understand emotional resilience as well. Wolves working together to raise pups during winter reinforced the value of community. Bears facing months of stillness revealed the importance of preparation. Birds returning each spring served as a reminder that winter, no matter how harsh, would eventually end. These creatures lived without fear of judgment, without expectations of controlling the season. They simply adapted. Humans integrated these lessons into their stories. Elders told children how wolves curled to keep their noses warm, how foxes dug shelters that resisted icy winds, how bears found safety in stillness. These stories served as both instruction and comfort, grounding human survival in a shared world where every creature fought the same cold. Children grew up watching the animals, not with wonder alone, but with quiet calculation. Every movement, an example, every shelter, a blueprint. Humans with time developed strategies that blended observation with innovation. They deepened sleeping pits to mimic dens, layered materials, as birds did, oriented their shelters using predator instincts, and adjusted their seasonal travel patterns based on herds. The natural world became a silent teacher, one that offered guidance without words. I often think that winter forced early humans to become students of the earth, leaning on the instincts of other creatures until they developed instincts of their own. The cold remained unforgiving, but humans grew wiser with each season. The creatures around them did not merely coexist, they shaped the human understanding of warmth, protection, movement, and resilience. In learning from them, humans found new ways to endure a world that gave nothing freely. Their borrowed wisdom strengthened their shelters and sharpened their instincts, yet winter continued to test every boundary of their endurance. Another challenge rose from the land itself, demanding choices that reshaped their yearly rhythm. Beyond these lessons from animals' movement became a question of survival. Winter remained an unforgiving force that shaped the fate of prehistoric communities in ways that left marks still visible in the fossil record. The cold did not strike evenly across regions. Instead, it moved like a silent boundary that divided those who adapted from those who faded away. Some groups had learned how to gather enough fat-rich food, how to insulate their shelters more effectively, and how to use fire with precision rather than hope. Others were not as fortunate. Their patterns of movement, their choices of shelter, and their lack of accumulated knowledge left them vulnerable to the season's severity. Entire clusters of dwellings show signs of abandonment, as if families slipped away quietly when the cold grew too heavy to bear. Archaeological sites across northern regions reveal layers of ash, bone, and primitive tools, abruptly ending at certain points, indicating a winter that erased continuity. The remains of these groups do not speak of violence or conflict. Instead, they show the quiet outcome of scarcity and cold. When temperatures dropped far below what their shelters could withstand, people faced choices no community wished to make. They either moved toward uncertain lands, or remained where death crept into every corner of their living space. It feels almost unreal that the end of a community could be written not in blood or battle, but in the slow, steady pressure of cold air seeping through weak walls. In certain areas, the repeated failure of winter survival transformed entire landscapes. Valleys that once hosted small groups became permanently empty, with no signs of later habitation. These places were not abandoned because they lacked food or water during warm seasons, but because their exposure made winter unbearable. Geological evidence shows that some of these regions faced intense snow accumulation and wind tunnels that stripped warmth from any shelter. Once a group failed to survive, other groups learned to avoid those same paths, shaping migration routes for generations. When compared to how people today choose where to live based on climate and comfort, the contrast is almost startling. Knowledge became the dividing line between disappearance and endurance. Groups that observed more carefully, adapted more quickly, and shared survival techniques more effectively managed to outlast their less prepared neighbors. They learned how to reinforce roofs with branches and hides, how to place fire pits deeper within shelters to block wind, and how to ration fat and protein through the darkest months. They understood that winter demanded planning long before its first frost arrived. Communities with elders who remembered previous winters held an advantage. Their stories became instructions, their warnings became laws of survival. As a result, their children grew up expecting winter's cruelty and shaping their behavior around it. Other groups lacking such continuity found themselves facing winter with insufficient experience. Without generational knowledge, each cold season felt new, unpredictable, and vastly overwhelming. Their shelters were built in locations that seemed convenient in summer, but deadly in winter. Some slept too far apart, losing potential warmth. Some failed to gather enough fuel for the fire, assuming nearby wood would last longer than it did. Others did not understand which foods offered sustained energy. The winter exposed every mistake, magnifying it until survival became impossible. Fossil patterns reveal clusters of remains belonging to the very young and the very old, those least able to endure prolonged cold and starvation. This uneven toll fractured family structures, making it harder for the group to continue. Without elders to pass on knowledge, and without children to carry knowledge forward, the community's future dissolved. It was not a sudden collapse, but a slow unraveling that began with small losses and ended with silence. Groups that survived often did so through a combination of discipline, observation, and cooperation. They treated winter preparation as a collective responsibility rather than an individual task. Shared food, shared shelters, and shared labor enhanced their resilience. People sleeping close together kept more heat. People gathering extra fuel ensured fires could remain steady through long nights. People reinforcing each other's shelters prevented collapses during storms. These small efforts intertwined to form a protective network that winter could not easily break. I have always found it striking that adaptation more than strength or bravery determined which communities endured the cold. Survival did not belong to those who fought winter, but to those who understood its rhythm and adjusted their lives accordingly. The fossil record may feel distant and mute, but it carries echoes of these choices. The empty settlements, the layered remains, and the spread of later human migration all point to winter as both a filter and a teacher. The cold shaped human history long before written memory existed. It selected habits, molded instincts, and refined skills that would define later generations. From the failure of some communities, others learned how not to repeat the same mistakes. Winter removed the unprepared but sharpened the survivors, ensuring that knowledge once earned would not be easily forgotten. Many groups failed to endure the cold, leaving behind traces of entire families erased by the season. Another path to survival emerged from the way some learned to shift their lives with the moving winds and wandering animals. As those journeys unfolded, the rhythm of migration began to reveal its quiet, perilous logic. The shift in movement during ancient winters was not a choice made lightly, and it was never a matter of comfort. It was something shaped by necessity, by hunger, and by the pressure of a landscape that grew harder with each passing day of cold. When temperatures dropped and the first signs of frost began to spread across the ground, some groups understood that staying in place would turn the season into a slow decline that few could endure. They watched the sky, the animals, and the patterns of the wind, and from those signs, they made decisions that carried them across wide stretches of land. The act of moving south was not a grand migration in the way modern people imagine it. It was a simple shift made to escape the cold that settled like a weight over the land, a weight that could crush the weak and tire the strong. Those who traveled followed narrow paths that had been walked by herds for generations. These trails wound through forests, across open plains, and along rivers that were beginning to freeze. The people walked behind these animals not because they wanted to, but because the animals knew where food might still exist. The herds rarely lingered in the same place for long, and the people understood that their own survival was tied to these movements. They carried whatever tools and supplies they could manage, often no more than a few skins, a handful of stones, and whatever food had not yet been consumed. Children were wrapped tightly and carried close to the body. The elderly walked slowly, protected in the center of the group, though not all of them managed the journey. Some communities adopted a semi-nomadic pattern. They built simple shelters in certain regions, but never considered them permanent. These shelters were used only when the weather was neither at its worst nor at its mildest. They served as temporary resting points along a larger cycle of movement that stretched across seasons. This pattern allowed them to avoid the most severe cold without being entirely dependent on one location. It reduced the risk of exhausting local resources and offered a rhythm that kept the group from falling into the stagnation that winter brought. The people's understanding of these cycles did not come from written knowledge, but from generations of observation and survival. Food was always a concern during these shifts. Hunting grew more difficult as animals became scarce. Those who followed migrating herds could sometimes find success, but others saw their traps empty for days. A poor hunt could force a sudden change in direction. Groups sometimes collided, sharing the same narrow paths and the same limited resources. These encounters were not always peaceful, as hunger made people tense and suspicious. Yet in some cases, small acts of cooperation emerged, especially when the cold pressed hard enough to blur the lines between strangers. Travel during winter was also a physical trial. The ground was uneven, slippery, and often covered with snow that hid holes and sharp stones. People moved cautiously to avoid injuries that could not be treated properly in the cold. A twisted ankle or deep cut could be a death sentence. Fires were difficult to maintain while traveling, so the group relied on brief stops to warm their bodies and eat whatever food was available. Rest was short and sleep was light. Everyone understood that each hour spent without progress allowed the cold to take more from them. A modern comparison would be the long evacuations people undertake during natural disasters, when entire communities walk or drive away from danger because staying behind would be fatal. The prehistoric version was slower and far more exposed, but the logic was similar: move or accept what the season would bring. It is almost strange to think about how predictable the danger was, yet how difficult it remained to avoid it. The people knew winter was coming, knew the cold would deepen, and yet each year the struggle repeated itself. There were times when groups reached their destination, only to find the area already strained by others who had arrived before them. This created competition not only for shelter, but for access to even the smallest supply of food. Some families split from the main group to search for safer ground, but smaller groups were more vulnerable to predators and harsh weather. This fragmentation sometimes led to entire lineages disappearing from the record. Other families endured by staying close to stronger groups, sharing the risks and the meager rewards of the journey. What held these movements together was a quiet understanding that the landscape had its own rules. People did not attempt to control it. They moved within its boundaries, accepted its limitations, and shaped their decisions around what the land allowed them to do. The cycle of migration became a habit, a seasonal rhythm that determined who survived and who did not. Over time, those who adapted to this pattern became tougher, more skilled, and more aware of the land's demands. Their descendants carried those experiences forward, and the pattern became part of their identity. These shifting routes marked the thin line between endurance and collapse. Another layer of winter survival emerged from how groups protected what little food they managed to secure along these journeys. During those efforts, the struggle to outlast the cold gained a new and fragile balance. Food storage inside the caves became one of the clearest measures of how long a group could endure the weight of an ancient winter. The cold season often arrived earlier than expected and lingered without mercy, tightening its grip long after every trace of autumn warmth had disappeared. People who walked these landscapes understood that survival was not only a matter of what they hunted, but also how they protected every scrap that remained. The emptiness of the land made this truth even sharper. Hunting failed, often animals migrated unpredictably, and a missed opportunity could cost more than a meal. It could cost a life. Inside the caves, the darkness worked both as a shelter and a quiet threat. The air stayed still, holding moisture that could ruin fresh meat if handled poorly. Hunters had to react quickly the moment an animal was brought down. Carcasses were skinned fat, set aside, and cuts of meat prepared for drying. Thick ropes, made from plant fibers or animal sinew, were tied to the cave's stone ledges. Meat was hung high, sometimes near the ceiling, an instinctive barrier that kept small predators from climbing up and stealing food during the night. The practice looked simple, but it demanded a balance of skill and patience. A single mistake, meat hung too low, too damp, or too close to smoke, could turn days of labor into spoiled waste. Fire played an important role, although not always in the direct way one might imagine. People often built small, smoldering piles beneath the hanging meat, not to cook it, but to dry it slowly. Smoke wrapped around the cuts, pushing away insects and adding a layer of preservation that extended their usefulness. Over time, the smell of smoke became tied to the idea of safety. Anyone entering the cave during winter would first sense that dim, bitter scent that promised nourishment waiting overhead. It is almost amusing how the same smoke that irritated their eyes became the closest thing they had to a guarantee of future meals. Salt as we know it did not exist in their world, at least, not in any refined form. Instead, they used ash in ways that resemble crude salting. Ash, from certain burned plants, was rubbed into strips of meat to pull out moisture and slow decay. Though far from perfect, the method stretched the lifespan of precious food during the darkest months. People learned this through repetition, observation, and desperation. Nothing was discarded lightly, especially fat. Fat was valued more than lean muscle, for it carried warmth in ways no other resource could. It fueled bodies when the cold hollowed them out. A bundle of dried fat could mean more than a pile of tools. Storage was not only a technical process, but also a shared responsibility. Older members of the group, too weak to hunt, tended the hanging racks, checking for signs of mold or animals trying to sneak in. Children watched and learned, tracing their fingers along the ropes and touching the hardened surface of dried cuts. In those moments, they saw survival not as an act of strength, but as a long chain of decisions that could not be broken. The food above them created a strange form of comfort. It was not abundant, but it was enough. If one compares this to today, it resembles stocking a modern refrigerator, while knowing no store exists to replace what runs out. Every piece mattered. Every bite carried the weight of planning, luck, and silent fear. When storms roared outside and the world seemed frozen in place, families sat beneath the hanging meat, listening to the faint crackling of embers. The cave was cold, but the knowledge that food waited above them kept the worst of despair from settling too deeply. Even with all their precautions, the threat of loss was constant. A sudden temperature rise could spoil entire batches. Animals sometimes became bold enough to claw their way into storage areas. Disease could spread through mishandled meat. Survival meant watching carefully, adjusting methods, and learning from each failure. The world did not forgive mistakes easily. I often think about how they managed this endless vigilance with so little margin for error. The storage pits carved into the earth added another layer of security. Some groups dug small recesses into the floor of caves, filled them with ash or snow, and buried pieces of fat wrapped in hide. These pits kept food cool and protected it from animals. People marked them with stones, knowing exactly where each reserve lay. It became a map of hope beneath their feet. During the hardest winters, families rationed everything. Meals grew smaller, and the precious fat was melted into soups to stretch it further. Each night, they counted what remained, calculating silently how long they could last. They tested the dried meat, bent the pieces to check their condition, and smelled the fat to ensure it had not spoiled. The care they placed into these rituals carried an unspoken truth. Survival depended on patience as much as strength. The deeper the winter pressed, the more important these stores became. Hunters sometimes returned empty-handed for days, their footsteps slow, shoulders tense with fear. Yet the group endured because food hung above them, dried and waiting. It was the quiet result of labor done long before the snow arrived. Proof that preparation mattered, even when nothing else could be controlled. Their caves held more than food. They held the thin promise that tomorrow would still arrive. Another struggle unfolded in how they guarded these reserves during the longest nights when hunger tested the limits of discipline. Inside that dim space, the fight against winter began to reveal shadows they rarely spoke of. Smoke filled the interiors of prehistoric shelters in ways that might seem suffocating to modern eyes, yet it served as one of the most reliable defenses against the crushing cold. These enclosed spaces, already dark and narrow, became even denser when fires were kept low and smouldering, releasing slow ribbons of heat and haze that clung to every surface. This smoky air trapped warmth, lingered longer than open flames, and provided a steady environment that protected bodies and stored goods from freezing temperatures. In shelters where survival was often reduced to the simplest forms of improvisation, smoke became an essential part of winter life. The people who lived through these long seasons understood their environment through touch, breath, and small adjustments made over countless winters. They learned that keeping a fire burning too openly wasted fuel and let heat escape. By feeding damp wood or soft moss into the embers, they encouraged the fire to smolder, producing thicker smoke that rose slowly and settled across the shelter like a blanket. Even when the air stung their eyes and pressed against their lungs, they accepted it because the heat it delivered might keep their children alive through the coldest hours. Clothing also relied heavily on this smoky atmosphere. Furs and hides, when worn in harsh environments, absorbed moisture easily, becoming heavy and dangerous if not dried properly. By hanging them along the upper beams of the shelter, directly in the path of the accumulating smoke, people created a natural drying rack. The heat rising from the slow fire below helped stiffen the hides and remove dampness, while the smoke added a protective layer that resisted insects and slowed decay. It is almost surprising how this unpleasant air became one of the most practical tools for preserving the very garments they depended on. As the season grew harsher, the shelter transformed into a space governed by careful routines. Families tended the fire, constantly watching how smoke moved, how it collected near the ceiling, and how long it hovered before thinning out. They learned to adjust the size of the entrance or shift stones around the fire to shape the airflow. These small decisions reflected instincts sharpened by necessity. Every winter reinforced their understanding of what worked and what failed, often did not leave survivors to correct it. Smoke also served as a natural disinfectant. Even though they lacked the terminology we now use, they sensed that smoky shelters reduced disease among stored foods and garments. The haze coated the meat, drying nearby, creating an environment less friendly to insects and bacteria. It filled cracks in the stone walls and flawed-tearing pests, seeking warmth during the coldest nights. This created a barrier of sorts, one that did not look like much, but quietly protected the shelter's interior from decay. If we compare this to current times, it resembles relying on a crude, ever-present purifier powered only by fire. For people accustomed to constant threats, the smoke carried layers of meaning. It signaled that warmth existed within the shelter. It marked that food could be preserved. It meant that clothes remained wearable. Without it, the interior would freeze quickly, making daily tasks nearly impossible. Children grew up recognizing the patterns of smoke movement, observing how elders kept it steady, and understanding that discomfort was preferable to the risks that came with a shelter too clean and too cold. Despite these advantages, smoke created its own hazards. Too much could make breathing difficult. Too little could let heat escape. The balance had to be maintained with vigilance. People with weakened lungs suffered more, yet there was rarely an alternative. Winter forced compromises, and smoke became one of the most significant ones. The smell of burned wood lingered on skin, hair, and garments long after the season changed, marking them as people who endured cold, not through comfort, but through adaptation and endurance. Within these smoky interiors, daily life unfolded quietly. Meals were prepared beside the smouldering fire, tools were repaired in the dim light, and families huddled near one another for additional warmth. The haze muted the outlines of objects, softening the walls and turning everything into subdued shapes. In this environment, the fire took on a central role, not as a bright source of warmth, but as a constant, low-burning presence that shaped the rhythm of their days. If hunters returned with fresh meat, the process of preservation would begin immediately. Smoke became the first line of defense. Hides were hung, fat was stored, and meat was placed near the fire to absorb the protective haze. People monitored these items throughout the day, altering their positions depending on the smoke's density. Winter demanded awareness, and smoke became a familiar companion. They learned to read as carefully as tracks in the snow. Even as the cold pressed harder against the world outside, the shelters remained anchored by their smoky cores. The air inside was thick, sometimes difficult to bear, but undeniably warmer. The people living there accepted the mild suffocation because it meant one more day of surviving conditions that had already taken countless lives across millennia. Their shelters became chambers of warmth, held together by smoke and patience. Another aspect of survival emerged from how they refined their hunting tools to match the deepening cold. During this shift in technique, Winter revealed yet another test of endurance waiting ahead. During the harshest winters, hunting shifted from a test of brute strength to an exercise in conserving every movement. The cold drained energy quickly, and long pursuits became dangerous rather than practical. Prehistoric hunters understood this reality, shaping their tools and strategies around the need to save strength while still securing enough food to endure the season. In this environment, the creation of winter-specific weapons became essential. These tools were built not for elegance or refinement, but for reliability in freezing conditions, where mistakes often carried fatal consequences. Simple traps became one of the most valuable inventions during these months. They required minimal energy to set up and could remain functional even when the hunters rested or searched for other resources. These traps were often constructed from materials found nearby, bent branches, heavy stones, or pits concealed beneath layers of snow. A well-placed snare could capture small animals without the need for a chase, providing precious fat that bodies needed to withstand the cold. Hunters checked these traps methodically, following routes they knew by memory, each visit offering either relief or another reminder of the season's demands. For larger prey, hunters relied on spears tipped with sharpened stone. The distance offered by these weapons was critical during winter, when getting too close to a cornered animal could be deadly. A weakened hunter, slowed by cold or exhaustion, risked injury that would not heal easily in freezing conditions. Spears allowed groups to maintain a safer space between themselves and their targets, while still delivering deep, effective wounds. Their stone points were crafted carefully, chipped layer by layer, until the edges became sharp enough to cut through thick fur and muscle. It is almost remarkable that these simple tools held such significance in determining whether a group would endure the season. The choice of prey also changed with the cold. Hunters prioritized animals rich in fat, such as reindeer and bears, because fat provided long-lasting energy and helped regulate body heat. Muscle meat alone was not enough to keep people alive during winter. Fat became the true measure of a successful hunt. Hunters learned to identify patterns in migration, movement, and behavior that increased their chances of finding animals carrying the highest reserves. This knowledge shaped through generations, and repeated winters guided where they set traps and how they positioned themselves during hunts. Hunting in winter required understanding not only weapons but also the landscape. Snow altered familiar terrains, hiding dangers beneath its surface. Frozen rivers created new paths but carried risks of cracking under weight. Cold winds masked scents, changing how animals reacted. Hunters adapted by watching the smallest details, how snow compressed under footsteps, how shadows lengthened across open fields, how breath drifted into the air. These observations influenced where they aimed, how far they stood, and which direction they approached from. If we compare this to today's standards, it resembles relying on instinct as a primary tool rather than equipment or technology. Spears and traps were not static inventions. They were refined based on trial failure and the immediate pressure to survive. Hunters thickened spear shafts for better grip when hands stiffened from cold. They adjusted stone points to prevent shattering on frozen bone. Traps were modified depending on snowfall or the strength of animals passing through an area. Each adjustment represented an understanding gained through hardship. These changes remained long after a single season ended, forming a growing body of knowledge that shaped future hunts. Setting traps or preparing spears was often a quiet task performed indoors or near small fires, where warmth allowed hands to move with greater precision. Flint knapping required steady concentration, and even small mistakes could ruin a stone point. Hunters stored finished spearheads, carefully wrapping them in hides to protect them from moisture and frost. A broken tool in the middle of a hunt could jeopardize the entire group, so preparation became as critical as the hunt itself. During the hunt, coordination among group members was essential. Individuals positioned themselves at different angles, guiding animals toward a kill zone or into areas where movement was limited by snow or terrain. The cold made communication difficult, and they often relied on gestures, shared habits, and the familiarity shaped from years of hunting together. Every action required discipline, because wasted movements meant wasted warmth, and warmth was survival. When a hunt succeeded, the work did not end. Meat and fat needed to be processed immediately to prevent spoilage even in freezing temperatures. Stones were used to cut strips of meat which were then hung or carried back to shelters. The bones of larger animals were cracked open to access marrow, a dense source of calories vital for surviving winter days. Hunters treated each successful hunt as both relief and responsibility. The fat stored from one large animal could sustain a group for days, sometimes longer if preserved correctly. Even with all these adaptations, hunting in winter remained dangerous. Slips on ice, errors in judgment, or failed traps could mean hunger for days. Injury could doom a hunter to freezing conditions before help arrived. Yet the knowledge accumulated from countless winters gave these groups the tools they needed to endure. Their weapons reflected not just craftsmanship, but the quiet persistence of people shaped by an unforgiving world. Their winter weapons carried the weight of survival, built from instinct, endurance, and the cold that shaped their every choice. Another layer of their struggle appeared in the way. Freezing temperatures slowly wore down the body, even when food was found. Within that quiet decline, winter exposed hidden dangers that waited for anyone who lingered too long in its grasp. Cold in prehistoric winters rarely arrived as a sudden force. Instead, it pressed slowly into daily life, settling into bodies and shelters with a quiet persistence that made it far more dangerous than the storms or blizzards people often feared. Hypothermia did not always announce itself with dramatic symptoms. It crept in through exhaustion, hunger, or a momentary lapse in warmth, weakening individuals in ways they often noticed too late. The cold tightened around them, gradually shaping the pace of their work, the length of their rest, and the strength available to resist illness. In this season, survival depended not only on food and fire, but on constant awareness of how the body responded to the environment. Nighttime was particularly dangerous. When people lay down to sleep, their movements slowed, their bodies cooled, and the fire usually died to low embers. Even inside shelters insulated with hides, smoke, or packed earth, the temperature dropped sharply. Sleep, which restored energy during other times of the year, became a moment of vulnerability. Many individuals who went to rest after a long day of hunting or gathering never woke again. Their breathing slowed, their hearts weakened, and the cold gradually took control. It is almost unsettling how something as familiar as sleep could turn into one of the most treacherous moments of the winter. Small injuries also became far more serious under these conditions. A cut from a stone tool or a scrape from rough terrain might seem minor, but the cold changed everything. When the body was chilled, blood flow slowed, and healing processes weakened. Infections took hold more easily, and swelling or bleeding could become difficult to control. Even movements became stiff, adding to the risk of further injury. The cold reduced the body's ability to fight off illness, turning wounds that would have healed in other seasons into threats that overshadowed entire families. If we compare this to current times, it resembles dealing with medical emergencies without tools, warmth, or safe conditions. Breathing also became a challenge. Winter air filled shelters with moisture and cold particles that irritated lungs. People inhaled smoky air from low-burning fires, and the cold outside tightened their chests. Respiratory illnesses spread quickly in these enclosed environments, affecting the young and the old most severely. Coughing fits weakened the body, further disrupting sleep and reducing the energy needed to maintain warmth. Sickness often circulated the shelter, moving from one person to another, until entire groups struggled with the same symptoms. Winter did not allow much time for recovery, and the combination of cold air, fatigue, and lack of nutrition made breathing difficulties one of the season's most common dangers. Fatigue accumulated silently throughout the winter. Hunting required strength, but food was scarce and uneven. Days with successful hunts were followed by stretches where prey moved farther away or hid in deep snow. This inconsistency in nourishment weakened bodies already dealing with the cold. Children lost energy quickly, elders struggled to keep pace, and adults carrying the weight of daily survival faced growing exhaustion. The more tired a person became, the more vulnerable they were to the slow decline that winter imposed. This gradual wear on the body often led to conditions that made survival nearly impossible. Inside shelters, people tried to counter these dangers through constant attention to warmth. They kept fires burning, adjusted sleeping positions, checked on those who seemed weaker, and repaired drafts that appeared in the walls. Even so, the cold always found a way through. The season forced people to live in a state of continuous vigilance. When one person weakened, others felt the strain as the group depended on every member to maintain stability. Winter was not only a challenge to individual strength, but also to the cohesion of the entire group. Prehistoric life required a deep understanding of how the cold affected the body. People learned to recognize early signs of trouble: slowed movement, pale skin, trembling that did not stop even near the fire. These indicators shaped how they organized tasks, distributed food, and arranged sleeping positions. Individuals who showed weakness might be brought closer to the fire or covered with additional hides. Children were watched closely as their smaller bodies lost heat faster than adults. Elders offered experience but needed protection from the cold. Managing these conditions became part of daily life. Despite all these efforts, the cold still claimed lives. The process was often slow, marked by days of declining strength rather than sudden collapse. Groups adapted as best they could, adjusting rituals, routines, and expectations based on who remained strong enough to endure. These patterns, repeated across countless winters, shaping cultural practices, family structures, and survival strategies, passed down through generations. Even as the season wore on, people continued to move, hunt, gather, and preserve food, because stopping meant surrendering to the cold entirely. They had no choice but to keep going, even when fatigue and illness threatened to overwhelm them. This persistence carried communities through long winters, but the losses they experienced left marks that influenced how they prepared for future seasons. The cold drained strength piece by piece, leaving bodies fragile long before the season ended. Another element of survival appeared in the way people adapted biologically to climates that pushed human limits. Through those distant changes, the story of endurance carried on in forms shaped directly by the winter itself. Long-term life in cold climates forced prehistoric groups to change not only their daily habits, but also the very structures of their bodies. These changes did not appear suddenly. They accumulated slowly across generations, shaped by countless winters that pushed human limits. Over time, people living in freezing regions began to show physical traits that supported survival in an environment where warmth was rare and energy loss happened rapidly. Each adaptation reflected the pressures of living where cold dominated every season and influenced nearly every decision. One of the most visible changes involved body shape. Individuals in colder regions often developed broader frames and thicker layers of fat. This body type helped conserve heat, losing less warmth to the surrounding environment. A larger mass meant slower cooling, and a rounder shape reduced the amount of exposed surface area. Families that carried these traits tended to endure winter more successfully, and those traits became increasingly common in communities that faced cold for many generations. It is almost startling how the demands of winter could shape the human body so directly over time. Skin tone also shifted in these regions. Areas with limited sunlight forced the body to adapt to absorb more of the scarce ultraviolet rays available. People living there gradually developed lighter skin, which allowed more efficient synthesis of essential nutrients triggered by sunlight. This was not a choice or a preference, but a response to the environment. Winters in these areas brought months of dim skies, short days, and weak rays. The body's ability to extract as much benefit as possible from limited light became a quiet but significant advantage in sustaining health during harsh seasons. If we compare this to present-day explanations, it resembles relying on the body itself as a tool for gathering what the sun rarely provides. Hair patterns also changed over generations. Some groups developed naturally thicker body hair or denser growth on the head, adding a layer of insulation against cold air. Although this trait varied widely in regions where winter temperatures dropped to extremes, even small increases in hair density could help reduce heat loss. Thicker eyebrows, fuller hairlines, and denser strands were not aesthetic features, but functional adaptations shaped by survival pressures. Children born with these traits often endured winter conditions more easily, and small advantages could accumulate across centuries. These genetic patterns were not uniform. Different regions produced different results based on climate resources and cultural practices. Some communities relied heavily on clothing and shelter innovations, which reduced the biological pressure to adapt physically. Others depended more on mobility, hunting strategies, or specific tools that complemented genetic traits. But in the coldest, most demanding environments, the body itself became one of the primary lines of defense against winter. Respiratory adaptations also played a subtle role. Individuals with nasal structures better suited for warming cold air before it reaches the lungs tended to manage winter breathing more effectively. Longer nasal passages, or slightly narrower structures, helped condition the air, reducing the shock caused by freezing temperatures. This small anatomical feature contributed to overall endurance during the coldest weeks, especially when people moved between indoor smoke-filled shelters and icy outdoor landscapes. Metabolism too reflected gradual adaptation. Communities surviving in constant cold often developed more efficient ways of processing fat, turning stored energy into heat at a faster rate. Their diets, already rich in fat from hunting animals, adapted to similar climates, further reinforced these metabolic tendencies. Groups that processed and stored fat more efficiently had higher survival rates, especially during prolonged periods without food. These advantages slowly shaped the characteristics passed through generations. Despite these adaptations, living in cold climates still demanded significant effort. Biological changes provided support, but they did not eliminate the dangers of frost hunger or respiratory illness. The cold tests every system of the body. Even genetically favored individuals struggled if clothing, shelter, or group cooperation were weakened. Adaptation did not guarantee survival. It simply improved the chances. Children demonstrated these traits clearly. Those who inherited both the physical build and the capacity to handle cold often endured early winters with fewer complications. Families recognized these strengths and incorporated them into their understanding of community resilience. Over time, such advantages influenced where groups traveled, how they organized responsibilities, and how they structured their shelters to support members with varying needs. The accumulation of these traits formed a quiet history written into the body itself. Long before written records existed, cold climates left marks on bones, hair, skin, and metabolism. These features remained even as groups migrated or climates changed around them. The body became evidence of environments, survived, challenges, endured, and winters overcome through persistence and adaptation. Even with these biological supports, winter remained a defining force. The environment shaped culture as strongly as it shaped genes. People used these bodily advantages to endure months of hunger, darkness, and freezing temperatures, knowing their survival rested partly on traits inherited from ancestors who had survived the same trials. The body carried the imprint of countless winters molded slowly by climates that demanded endurance. Another lens on survival appeared in the customs and rituals groups built around fire and togetherness during long, harsh seasons. Among those traditions, winter revealed how culture itself became a shelter against the cold. Winter shaped not only the physical routines of prehistoric groups, but also the customs that held them together during long, dark months. In places where the cold could linger well beyond the length of a season, communities developed shared practices that offered structure and comfort when survival felt uncertain. These customs formed slowly across generations, influenced by the need to maintain morale, strengthen unity, and keep watch over the elements that allowed them to endure. The harshness of winter demanded more than practical tools. It required rituals that steadied the mind when darkness and silence stretched for too long. Fire naturally became the center of these customs. People gathered around it not only for warmth, but for a sense of stability in a season filled with threats. The glow of the flames offered a point of focus when the world outside fell into deep cold and darkness. Groups often held gatherings around this fire, using its warmth as a backdrop for shared activity. These gatherings helped maintain social bonds during periods when hunting and traveling became difficult. The fire created a space where the group could pause, breathe, and remain connected despite the restrictions winter imposed. These gatherings sometimes took the form of simple celebrations. They were not elaborate events, but moments where people acknowledged the fact that they had endured another day of cold. Even modest gestures, such as offering pieces of meat, adjusting hides to improve seating, or tending the flames, became quiet acts of unity. Over time, these actions developed into small traditions that repeated each winter. Families and groups found reassurance in the familiar routines, especially when storms isolated them for days. Storytelling also grew from these moments. With little daylight and few opportunities for movement, people filled the long hours with shared memories, accounts of hunts, or retellings of experiences passed down from older generations. These stories helped maintain morale and provided context for the dangers they faced. Listening allowed individuals to feel less alone during the darkest parts of the season. It is almost striking how these spoken moments helped steady entire groups when winter placed pressure on every part of daily life. Storytelling also served another purpose. It taught younger members how to interpret the environment. Winter demanded knowledge passed through memory rather than written instruction. Through stories, the young learned how to track animals in snow, how to judge the strength of ice, and how to manage fear when storms closed in. These lessons blended practical survival with the emotional endurance required to face months of darkness and cold. Some groups also developed beliefs around fire. Its presence was more than a source of heat. It represented continuity. A fire that survived the night signaled that the group would survive too. People watched the flames closely, understanding that their lives depended on keeping them alive. This careful attention gradually formed into small rituals. Individuals might approach the fire in a certain order, or offer specific materials believed to strengthen its warmth. These acts did not need a formal structure to influence group behavior. They simply emerged from the instinctive need to protect the one element that kept winter's danger at a distance. If we compare this to current practices, it resembles maintaining a constant source of security when all other conditions remain unstable. The belief that fire protected the group shaped behavior in subtle ways. People assigned someone to watch it, even during long nights when fatigue settled heavily across the shelter. Families arranged their sleeping spaces based on proximity to the flames. When storms raged outside or when the air grew dangerously cold, the fire took on symbolic significance. Keeping it lit meant more than comfort. It meant resisting the forces that threatened to overwhelm them. These customs strengthened group cohesion. Winter often reduced mobility and increased reliance on one another. When food was scarce, the group needed unity to ration resources and distribute tasks. When illness spread, they needed calm to prevent panic. Rituals around fire and stories helped maintain this cohesion. They gave structure to nights that would otherwise feel endless, and offered moments of steadiness when cold made everything uncertain. Over time, these customs became defining markers of identity. Even when groups migrated or climates shifted, they carried these traditions with them. The way they arranged their fires, the types of stories they favored, and the small gestures of sharing warmth followed them into new environments. These practices were reminders of their history, shaped by winters that had tested their endurance repeatedly. Winter left little room for unnecessary movement or risk, so these customs developed naturally from what people needed most: connection, structure, and a sense of safety. Even when storms pressed against the shelters, or when darkness extended across weeks, these rituals helped individuals remember that they belonged to something larger than their own struggle. Through these shared moments, groups reinforced the emotional endurance required to survive. By the end of each winter, these customs had guided them through hunger, illness, cold, and long stretches of silence. They carried the memory of each gathering, each story, and each watchful night by the fire. These experiences, repeated year after year, built a cultural memory as durable as the tools they crafted for survival. Their winter customs held communities together when the cold pressed hardest against their shelters. Another thread of survival emerged from the resilience of earlier generations who endured and adapted across countless winters. Through that lineage, the story of human endurance reached its final and quiet conclusion. The long path through prehistoric winters reaches its end with the understanding that our existence today depends on those who survived conditions far more severe than anything most of us will ever face. Their endurance was not shaped by advanced tools or scientific knowledge. It came from instinct, strengthened through constant exposure to cold, hunger, and uncertainty. Each winter challenged their bodies and their judgment. Each decision they made carried consequences that extended beyond their own lives. The ones who survived were not always the strongest, but they were the ones who continued to adapt when the environment offered little room for error. Their shelters were cramped and dim. Their fires were small and fragile. Their resources were limited, and their margin for failure was almost non-existent. Still, they found ways to use what they had. They worked with bone, stone, fat, and hide. They learned the patterns of animals, the direction of the winds, and the behaviors of storms. They learned when to move, when to stay, and when to accept loss. Winter shaped every part of their routine. It formed their habits, guided their diets, influenced their family structures, and dictated the pace of their days. Nothing existed outside the reach of the season. Over many generations, this pressure created people who could endure conditions that would overwhelm most modern bodies. Their frames became sturdy, their instincts sharpened. Their understanding of the environment, though unwritten, became deeply ingrained. They recognized the signs of approaching storms. They sensed when food sources were shifting. They knew how long a fire would last from the sound of its embers. Their world was unforgiving, but they learned to read it as clearly as we read familiar symbols today. The lack of technology forced them into constant awareness. Without insulated clothing, properly built chimneys, or reliable tools, every task required care. Preparing food took longer, building a shelter required planning, maintaining fire demanded attention. These slow, deliberate actions filled their days, and none of them could be neglected without inviting danger. Their lives were grounded in steady rhythms that matched the demands of the season. Children in these communities grew up watching these patterns. They learned how to move in the cold before they learned how to speak fluently. They understood that warmth was scarce and needed to be protected. They learned not to waste energy on unnecessary movements. They recognized that sleep was both a necessity and a risk. Their education came from observation and repetition rather than structured teaching. Winter shaped their earliest memories, teaching them the cost of carelessness. Elders held knowledge that kept the group alive. They remembered the years when storms lasted longer or food grew scarce. They passed on strategies that had worked in previous seasons. Their experience reduced the number of mistakes younger members might make. The group relied on them, not for authority but for survival. Their presence represented continuity through countless winters. Even though these people lacked modern concepts of health, physics, or biology, their solutions often aligned with principles understood today. They created insulation by layering hides and building low ceilings. They controlled airflow by blocking drafts and shaping entrances. They preserved fat and meat through controlled smoke. Their methods were practical responses to repeated exposure to severe conditions. The accuracy of their instincts came from accumulated experience across many generations. Their perseverance did not come from comfort. It came from the necessity to continue. Winter forced them into constant restraint. They did not overextend themselves. They did not travel without purpose. They did not waste food. They accepted the weight of the environment and worked within it rather than against it. This mindset kept them alive when the cold pressed hardest against their shelters. Over time, the groups that adapted most effectively became the ancestors of people living today. Surviving winter required genetic traits that supported endurance. It required cultural habits that reduced risk. It required practical knowledge that could be passed from one generation to the next. Those who could not adjust did not leave descendants. Their lines ended quietly in snow-covered landscapes, marked only by traces that would be found millennia later. The endurance of prehistoric people reveals a slow, steady form of strength. Their resilience was not heroic, it was continuous. It was patient. It was repeated through daily effort rather than dramatic action. They faced the cold, not with confidence, but with acceptance of the work required to outlast it. That quiet persistence carried humanity through an age when winter acted as a yearly trial. Today, their struggles remain distant from most of our experiences. Modern heating, insulated homes, and abundant food separate us from the pressures that shaped them. Yet the fact remains that our bodies, our cultures, and our histories were built on their survival. Without their endurance, none of the later developments in agriculture, settlement, or civilization could have occurred. Their daily choices, driven by necessity, formed the foundation for everything that followed. Their legacy exists not in stories or monuments, but in the fact that life continued through conditions that erased entire groups. Their adaptation allowed the population to grow slowly. Their persistence allowed knowledge to accumulate across centuries. Their survival ensured the continuation of lineages that eventually reached every part of the world. As we imagine them, gathered near small fires, adjusting hides, preparing food, and watching storms pass across the landscape, we see people whose existence depended on cooperation and continuous effort. The cold shaped their behaviors, but it did not break them. They learned to breathe through the smoke. They learned to rest in cramped shelters. They learned to move with caution across frozen ground. Their world demanded attention, and they gave it without hesitation. This closing reflection brings the journey through prehistoric winter survival to an end. It follows the quiet, steady rhythm of their lives and acknowledges the weight of their achievements. Their endurance supports ours, even if the connection is separated by thousands of years. Understanding this link gives a clearer view of how humanity reached the present. As night settles, the memory of their winter shelters and low-burning fires lingers. The cold that shaped them no longer reaches us in the same way. Yet the story of their survival remains a reminder of what persistence can achieve when conditions leave no room for error. This concludes the long path through prehistoric winters. May the quiet resilience of those early people settle into your thoughts as the day ends. May your night be warm, steady, and safe. May sleep come to you gently, without the presence of the cold they once faced.